Hey guys, tonight we're plunging headfirst into something crusty. Medieval Europe, the era of knights, castles, cathedrals, plagues, and let's be honest, terrible, terrible smells. You might have romanticised the time period before, picturing candlelit banquets and noble quests, but we're about to yank that illusion off like a scab. This is the real deal. The raw, unfiltered, nose-wrinkling truth about hygiene in the Middle Ages. And spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. Not just from the rats or the dysentery, but from the sheer onslaught of bacteria, filth, and social norms that made washing your hands something you'd maybe do. Once a month. Maybe. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, what city are you watching from, and what time is it right now where you are? I want to know who else is up with the weirdos deep diving into old dirt tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Okay. Picture this. You walk through the gates of a medieval town just as dawn peels across the thatched rooftops. A fog of smoke and manure hangs low. The smell hits you like a warm, wet towel soaked in pig juice and regret. Beneath your feet is a slurry of mud, animal droppings and, well, human contributions too. This isn't some back alley, this is the main street, the town square, the epicentre of trade, politics, love affairs and lunch. People shuffle by in woolen cloaks, not a pair of clean shoes in sight. Children play next to a dead rat no one's picked up yet. A butcher dumps a pail of congealed offal into the street gutter, and a stray dog wades in happily. And you're just there, trying not to breathe through your nose. And here's the thing, this wasn't considered gross, this was normal. You step into a home, maybe a simple timber frame cottage. There's no sink, no running water, no soap dish, because most people didn't own soap. You see a family of 7, all sharing one single bowl of cloudy, tepid water to wash up in the morning. The father goes first, then mum, then the kids in descending age order. By the time it's baby Edith's turn, that water has gone full primordial soup. But hey, at least they're washing, because even that was optional. You see, the very idea of being clean meant something wildly different back then. Today, we link cleanliness to health and aesthetics. Back then, cleanliness was mostly about social class and religious observance. You cleaned up when you had to appear pious or show respect for your station, but not because you were worried about bacteria. Germ theory wasn't a thing. Invisible killer bugs in your body sounded like witchcraft. Also, quick historical fact, while we're dunking on medieval Europe, you should know that the Islamic world at the same time had a significantly stronger culture of hygiene, with public bathhouses, detailed cleanliness rituals, and actual medical texts that emphasise sanitation. So, not all medieval times were this bad, just the part of the world we're focusing on tonight. Back to your miserable stroll through town. You dodge a splash as someone empties a chamber pot from an upstairs window. Yep, that's not just dirty dishwater, that's everything that came out of somebody last night. There might be a shout, "Garde l'eau," if you're lucky. French for, "watch out for the water." But most of the time, people just flung and hoped. You peek into a church and see folks packed together, clutching prayer beads with hands that haven't seen soap in a month. There's incense in the air, mostly to mask the people smell. A priest's robes look elegant from afar, but get closer and, oof, that's 10-year-old sweat and incense residue. Because laundry, that's a saga we'll get to later. Now, here's something fun. A quirky little fringe fact that might blow your mind. Despite the general filth, medieval people didn't love being dirty. Many actually liked the idea of being clean. They just had terrible access, weird superstitions and no consistent infrastructure. So it wasn't that they were all cool with filth, it's that they had very few good options and often some very bad advice. Let's say you get a cut on your hand. Nothing big, just a scrape. But in a world without antiseptic, where water might carry parasites, and cloth was usually reused and rarely washed, congratulations, that scrape could absolutely fester into a full-blown limb-rotting infection. Die from a paper cut sounds ridiculous today, but it was real. This is why you, dear traveller, probably won't survive this time period. Not from sword fights, from splinters. There's scholarly debate, by the way, about just how bad hygiene was. Some argue that peasants had reasonable routines like washing their hands before meals, and that bathhouses in certain periods were widespread and well used. But others say those accounts are idealised, or only refer to the wealthier classes. Either way, what's clear is that cleanliness wasn't standardised. It was deeply regional, class-based, and inconsistent at best. As you head back out of the town square, you pass a barber surgeon sharpening his tools by an open fire. That blade's seen 20 uses today. No sanitising. He'll use it next on someone's infected foot. Then maybe trim a noble's beard. And you think, maybe I'll just live in the forest. Except the forest. That's where you meet wolves and outlaws, and the same lice you had in town, just more rustic. So yeah, tonight's journey is going to be aromatic, itchy, and probably fatal. But also kind of fascinating. Because the more you see just how different daily life was, the more you start appreciating modern plumbing, and deodorant, and toothpaste, and washing machines, and, honestly, just a hot shower. And guess what? This was just the welcome mat. Next up, we're diving into actual bathing practices. Spoiler, you're not going to feel clean for days. So, you're still alive, barely. And now we get to talk about baths. Not luxurious bubble baths with candles and a playlist of sad indie music, but medieval style, where the water's lukewarm at best, shared with half your household, and may or may not have bits of hay floating in it. And let's be clear from the start. Full-body bathing in medieval Europe was for most people an occasional event, a maybe once-a-season kind of deal, like a lunar eclipse, or your cousin finally returning that book you lent them 6 years ago. You stroll into a village and spot what passes for a bathhouse. It's a wooden structure with steam drifting from tiny slits between the planks. It smells like boiled cabbage and desperation. Inside, people are sitting together in what looks like a giant soup bowl made of wood. The water is murky, almost opaque, and there are actual twigs in it, because apparently bushes were an acceptable filter system. Bathhouses like these were more common than you might think, especially in the earlier part of the Middle Ages. Monks loved them, city folks tolerated them, and peasants, well, they hoped for a rainy day and stood under the eaves. Here's the thing though, early on, especially in the 12th and 13th centuries, public bathhouses were actually kind of trendy in parts of Europe. People paid a small fee to sit in hot water, socialise, maybe even get a quick scrub down from an attendant. But over time, bathhouses got complicated. They became associated with less than wholesome activities, as in prostitution. And the church started to side-eye them. Communal nudity, steamy rooms, potential sin. Not exactly what the bishops were going for. By the time the plague hit, bathhouses were getting shut down in a lot of places, partly because of the fear they spread disease. Which is hilarious in retrospect, because not bathing probably did more damage. Now imagine you're not rich. You don't live in a town with a bathhouse. You're a peasant. Your bath involves heating up a bucket of water over a smoky fire and pouring it into a shallow tub made of wood, tin, or whatever you can afford. One person uses it, then the next. Kids last. You hope no one has fleas. You are not optimistic. And that's assuming you even have enough fuel to heat water. Firewood was a precious commodity. Peasants often didn't waste it on luxury things like bathing. They needed it to cook, keep warm and not die. So a cold water splash in a stream, or a quick rinse with water from the rain barrel was the usual method. In winter, you might just wait it out until spring. Layer up, stink quietly, and pretend it's normal. Now let's talk about soap, or whatever passed for it. Medieval soap was a far cry from the vanilla-scented body wash you know and love. The typical version was made of animal fat mixed with ashes or lye, resulting in a greyish, gritty block that stung your eyes and left your skin vaguely greasy. In some parts of Europe, like Spain and Italy, more sophisticated, soap-making techniques came in from the Islamic world, which used olive oil and fragrances. But if you were in England or northern France, you got the animal fat special, and that's if you even had access to soap. Many peasants used simple scrubbing with cloth, sand, or just water. Others might use herbs like rosemary or lavender, if they were lucky, to help mask the smell. But cleansing, that was relative. A weird little detail here. Some medieval people did believe that warm water could open your pores, which sounds great, right? Spa science? Not quite. They thought open pores let in disease, so in some periods bathing was seen as dangerous, You'd get clean, your pores would be all vulnerable, and suddenly, boom, plague. This wasn't some fringe superstition either. Royal courts debated this. Medical scholars wrote about it. Better to stay a little filthy than risk your soul and your lungs. Now, here's a quirky fringe detail that feels so medieval it almost loops back around to being charming. People sometimes bathed in wine. Yep, wine baths. Not for peasants, of course. This was a luxury rich people indulged in for health and status. Bathing in herbs, milk, or even vinegar was also a thing, supposedly to draw out poisons or enhance beauty. Cleopatra style, except replace the elegance with half a dozen watching servants and a background chorus of coughing fits. There's also a fascinating scholarly debate around the frequency of bathing. Some sources, especially from the early Middle Ages, describe people bathing regularly, at least once a week, or before religious observances. But then we hit the Black Death in the 14th century, and boom, public fear of water skyrocketed. Bathhouses shut down, private bathing declined, you didn't want to get too clean, you might die. It's the original anti-wellness trend. So here you are, living in the medieval countryside. It's midsummer, you haven't bathed in 3 weeks, and you're not even the dirtiest person in your village. You wipe your face with a cloth dipped in stale beer because the water from the well has something suspicious swimming in it. Your hair is crunchy, your socks are stiffer than your grandmother's gingerbread, but no one says anything, because this is the norm. And the worst part, you're probably used to it. You've adjusted, like that one pair of jeans you refuse to wash because they've moulded perfectly to your body. You start convincing yourself that maybe sweat has a natural appeal. Anyway, this is your new reality, the age of dirt. And we've only just begun. Next up, soap. If you thought the bathwater was bad, wait until you learn how they made cleaning products in a world where animal carcasses were just part of the scenery. Alright, now that you've reluctantly lowered yourself into the murky waters of medieval bathing, let's pivot to the next horror, soap. Or more specifically, the thing people called soap, which you and your modern sensibilities would probably classify as an aggressive, possibly weaponized cleaning brick. This wasn't your lemon zest foaming pump. This was medieval soap, abrasive, smelly, sometimes corrosive, and often made under conditions that would give a modern health inspector heart palpitations. Let's set the scene. You're walking past a village market and get a whiff of something sharp and almost acidic in the air. You follow it to a stall that looks suspiciously like a slaughterhouse, and a blacksmith's shed had a messy child. A woman is stirring a giant cauldron of bubbling grey goop, and you quickly realise this is where the local soap is being made. The ingredients? Rendered animal fat, usually from pigs or cows, mixed with ashes from wood fires. That combination makes lye, a highly alkaline substance that can literally eat through cloth if mixed wrong, or your skin. But hey, it technically kills bacteria. Probably. When the mixture cools, it becomes a sticky, pungent slab that's cut into blocks. And yes, people used it. On their bodies, on their clothes, on their floors. One product fits all. You might think that sounds efficient, but let's just be honest here. It stung, it reeked, and it left you smelling slightly like roasted pork and campfire. People didn't walk away from their wash routines feeling refreshed. They walked away slightly irritated and possibly chemically burned. The funny part is they wanted better soap. Everyone did. But only the wealthier households could afford imported perfumed soap, like the fancy Castile soap from Spain, made with olive oil and often scented with herbs or citrus peel. That stuff, that was gold. Literal soap royalty. If you had a bar of that in your home, you probably locked it away so your housemaid didn't shave it down to wash her underclothes. It smelled good, looked smooth, and didn't peel off your top layer of skin. In other words, suspiciously modern. For peasants, though, it was the animal fat bar or nothing. And sometimes, it was nothing. A quick rinse in water, a bit of sand or ash rubbed on the skin to exfoliate the grime. Maybe a rosemary branch waved vaguely around your armpits for morale. That was it. If it was winter, you just embraced your inner dirtbag and hoped everyone around you was equally nose-blind. Now here's a little fact to file under thanks but no thanks. In some regions they would collect urine, yes, actual human urine, and let it sit for days to produce ammonia. The resulting substance was used as a cleaning agent, particularly for laundry and sometimes even for degreasing hands and tools. In places like Roman-era Britain, this was already common practice, and the medieval world didn't totally abandon it. It worked, sure, but that smell, unforgettable. And get this, there were soap taxes. In certain places, like medieval England, soap became so important that monarchs started taxing its production. Because nothing screams luxury good like a lumpy chunk of pig grease and caustic ash that smells like someone boiled a boot. So what did the average person actually smell like on a normal day, you ask? Well, try to picture a cocktail of body odour, wood smoke, wet wool, dried mud, whatever they cooked that morning, and a hint of soap that somehow smelled worse than the grime it was meant to remove. Toss in the scent of whatever religious charm bag or herbal sachet they wore to ward off illness, and you've got a scent profile more complex than a sommelier's wine list. Except all of it is bad. Here's where things get really murky though. Scholars still debate how often people really used soap. Some medieval texts suggest regular washing, at least hands and face, but those are often written by clergy or the upper classes. Peasant life didn't exactly get documented in excruciating detail, and because archaeological evidence of personal soap is, well, slimy at best, we're left guessing. Some argue that peasants cleaned themselves as best they could with the resources available, especially before meals or prayers. Others say cleanliness was sporadic at best, something that happened only when necessary, or if a ritual demanded it. There's also a spiritual wrinkle here. The church didn't outright ban soap, but it didn't exactly encourage it either. Cleanliness of the soul was more important than the body. Taking pride in your appearance could be seen as vanity, and vanity, of course, was a sin. So if you cared too much about looking or smelling fresh, people might raise an eyebrow. You were supposed to be humble, modest, maybe a little crusty. Which brings us to a weird and delightful little fringe belief. Some thought too much washing actually weakened you, as in washing away your body's natural protective layer made you more vulnerable to disease or even demonic influence. Yes, clean people might actually be spiritually too exposed. So when your local blacksmith shows up to church smelling like he wrestled a goat in a pit of onions, maybe he's just protecting himself. From hell. You keep walking through town, nose half plugged, and you realise that the soap problem wasn't just a matter of hygiene. It was deeply tied to class, religion, medicine, and even fear. Cleanliness wasn't just about looking nice. It was tangled in identity, belief, and survival. And while we might mock their methods today, medieval folks were doing their best with the tools they had, boiling fat, scraping ash, dodging plague, and all. So the next time you squirt your overpriced lemongrass gel into a steaming shower, just take a second to whisper a little thank you to the ghosts of all the medieval people who endured chemical burns and pea laundry so you could smell like a fresh citrus grove. And next up, we're going deep into the beloved tradition of sharing washwater with your entire family. One bucket, everyone's grime. Welcome to the one bucket rule. Bring a towel. Or maybe don't. Let's get into something intimate tonight. Real close quarters, real shared experiences. You, your siblings, your parents, maybe even grandma. One tub, one bucket of water. Welcome to the one bucket rule, medieval style, where cleanliness was communal and privacy was a myth. Forget personal space. Forget hot water on demand. This is the kind of bonding that either makes you family for life, or makes you contemplate living alone in the woods forever. So here you are, end of the day, and the family decides it's bath night. Not a bath for each person night, a bath night. Singular. Someone heats water over the hearth, takes about an hour to get it hot enough not to freeze your soul, and pours it into the one family basin. This basin might be made of wood or metal if you're doing well. It's been patched a few times, maybe leaks slightly, but hey, it holds most of the liquid. First in is the patriarch, of course. Father gets the cleanest water, it's a respect thing. He soaks, scrubs what can be scrubbed, and exits, hopefully cleaner than he went in. But now, that water's a bit cloudy, still warm though. Next up, mother, then the oldest child, then down the line until you hit the youngest. By the time it's your turn, the water has taken on a personality of its own. It's no longer liquid, it's a stew. There are things floating in it that weren't there before. You can name at least 2 of them, and you wish you couldn't. But this isn't weird. This is just what everyone does. Nobody has running water. Fuel for fires is expensive. Heating multiple tubs is for royalty, and you are not royalty. You're just a kid trying not to think about what part of your brother's foot just brushed against your leg in the communal bath broth. And if you think this was a rural-only tradition, surprise. Even city dwellers without access to bathhouses often did the same thing. Families would either take turns using a single bath in sequence, or literally get in together. There are accounts of full families bathing simultaneously, chatting, passing cloths, helping each other wash backs and hair. It was less about luxury and more about efficiency. Think of it as multitasking with questionable hygiene. Now let's talk about how often this happened. Bath night wasn't a weekly ritual. It was more like whenever it feels like someone might be close to growing mushrooms. Once a month was generous, more often during warmer months, less often in winter. In fact, during the cold seasons, families sometimes avoided bathing altogether, fearing that wet skin would lead to illness. Not just colds, real illness, like fevers and death. And with no antibiotics or modern medicine, that fear wasn't completely unfounded. In some villages, bath night became a social event. Neighbours might know when your family bathed. People would trade tips about herbal infusions to add to the water. Lavender if you had it, mint if you were fancy, maybe a splash of vinegar to cut the grease. And that same tub, by the way, might be used earlier in the day for doing laundry or soaking vegetables. Welcome to medieval multitasking. Everything serves more than one purpose, including you when you inevitably dump the water afterward onto the garden, or, more often, just outside the front door. Here's a strange but true little historical tidbit. There were parts of medieval Europe where bathwater was believed to carry protective properties, especially the water used by holy people or monks. People might actually collect the bathwater of respected figures and use it to bless their children or rub into wounds, which sounds deeply unsanitary. But in a world with limited understanding of disease, symbolism often trumped science. Speaking of monks, some monastic orders had set routines for washing, sometimes weekly, sometimes even more often. But the monks weren't necessarily sitting in soapy bliss. More often they would rinse in cold water, maybe with a rough cloth, as part of their spiritual discipline, cleanliness as an act of humility and endurance. Meanwhile, out in the real world, peasants were cleaning themselves with river water that may or may not also be serving as the town's latrine. You make do. Now there's something else you notice as you emerge from the now lukewarm tub, shivering and a little queasy. There's no towel. Not really. Cloth is valuable. There might be a shared drying cloth hanging near the hearth. Maybe something vaguely dry, already damp from the last two people. Or you just air dry, standing there like a soggy duck hoping not to catch a breeze. Your feet touch the dirt floor. Great. You're instantly dirty again. It's fine. You're clean adjacent. There's a scholarly back and forth about how much people actually minded this. Some argue that folks didn't view dirt the way we do. Smell wasn't necessarily offensive, it was expected. The body had a natural odour, and masking it was mostly reserved for the upper class or religious rituals. Other historians suggest people did care, especially before church days or public feasts. A clean face, clean hands, maybe even a little perfumed oil if you could afford it. These things mattered in social standing, even if your socks could stand up on their own. Now here's a slightly gross, slightly amazing fringe fact. Some wealthier homes saved bath water after family used to be boiled down and reused. Yep, that's right. Soapless grey broth of human bits gets saved and used again the next day. Economical? Sure. Nightmarish? Absolutely. But in a world where fresh water took work and soap was scarce, you didn't let a good gallon go to waste. As you sit there, toweling off with a cloth that smells like smoke and mildew, you realise something. This isn't just about getting clean. This is about routine, family life, and adapting to circumstances. There's a strange kind of intimacy in sharing something so personal and mundane. Everyone smells a little weird. Everyone's a little damp, but you're in it together. Kind of beautiful. Kind of terrible. Very medieval. So next time you're annoyed your shower water isn't instantly hot, just picture kneeling in a wooden tub of someone else's leg water, staring at a cracked wall, while your little brother practices cannonballs right next to your face. Suddenly, that 15-minute steamy solitude sounds divine. Anyway, dry off, because next up we're going to brighten that smile the medieval way, with twigs, soot and some very questionable dental beliefs. Brush up, it's about to get gritty. Alright, let's talk about your teeth. Or at least what's left of them. In the Middle Ages, your smile was less about dazzling anyone and more about, well, surviving the week without a molar exploding in your skull. Dental hygiene back then was an absolute gamble. You might be lucky enough to go your whole life with minimal pain, or you might end up with your face swollen like a turnip and someone with iron tongs offering to fix it. There were no dentists as we know them, no Novocaine, no toothbrush aisle at the local medieval market. But hey, people did try, sometimes. So you wake up in your little timber-framed house, the light from the cracks in the shutters hitting your face, and you smack your lips. Something tastes awful. Probably that leftover stew you fell asleep eating, or the fact that your mouth is a swamp. But you don't just shrug and move on. No, it's time to clean your teeth medieval style, which means you grab a twig. Not just any twig, mind you, something fibrous, maybe from a hazel, willow, or birch tree. You chew the end until it frays into a brush-like cluster, and then you start scraping. And honestly, it kind of works. In a no other options kind of way, chewing sticks, also called toothsticks or miswaks in other cultures, were a pretty common method of dental cleaning, and they're still used in some parts of the world today. They freshen breath, remove food bits, and stimulate gums. Not bad for a chunk of tree, but there's no mint flavour, no fluoride, just bark, your spit, and blind hope. If you were fancy, or just more determined to avoid mouth rot, you might use a cloth dipped in salt or ash to rub your teeth clean. Sometimes people even mixed in herbs like sage or rosemary. Sage in particular was thought to help whiten teeth and freshen breath. So now you're brushing your teeth with a paste that's basically salty plant soot. Yummy. Of course, that assumes your teeth are even still there. Dental decay was a common issue, especially for wealthier people who had access to more refined and sugar-rich diets. Honey, dried fruits, and even imported sugar for the aristocrats. These things wrecked teeth faster than you could say, root canal. For peasants, who mostly ate coarse grains, porridge and veggies, it was a mixed bag. Less sugar? Good. But also more grit and stone dust in your bread from badly milled flour, which wore down enamel like sandpaper. By 40, your teeth might look like little grey nubs with a couple of survivors clinging to the back row. Now here's a quirky little fringe fact that sounds more like a horror story. Some medieval people used powdered charcoal to clean their teeth. That's right, burnt wood, black powder, rubbed directly into their gums. And yes, you've probably seen this trend come back in some influencer's skincare line. But medieval folks weren't doing it for the aesthetics. They believed it would absorb impurities and whiten teeth, never mind the abrasiveness slowly soaring through your enamel. But hey, no cavities if you grind your teeth down to the gums, right? But what about toothaches? Oh, those were real. And terrible. No one's making it to old age without experiencing the blinding misery of a rotting molar. If you complained, you'd be offered some creative remedies. Some people believed you had a toothworm, a literal worm that lived inside the tooth and caused pain. Treatments included smoking the worm out with herbs or incense. Others tried drilling, yes, manually, with a hot needle to relieve pressure. It did relieve something, probably consciousness. And if all else failed, tooth extraction, done by the local barber surgeon. You sit in a wooden chair, someone holds your shoulders down, and he comes at your face with a pair of iron pliers. No numbing, no sanitation, just pure brute force and screaming. If you're lucky, the tooth comes out clean. If you're not, it shatters, and the root stays behind to fester. Either way, your jaw's gonna swell like a melon, and you're not eating solid food for days. There's a scholarly debate over just how bad medieval teeth really were. Some archaeological digs show surprisingly decent dental health in certain populations, especially rural peasants. Others reveal mouths that look like abandoned construction sites, cracked, decayed, infected. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Diet, social status, location, and sheer dumb luck all played a role. And of course, let's not forget the breath. With no mouthwash, no toothpaste, and maybe one good brushing stick between you and the rest of your family, medieval breath was an offensive weapon. Garlic-heavy stews, meat left out too long, and a rotting molar in the back? That's the kind of combo that clears a room. People did try to help themselves, chewing mint or fennel seeds, sucking on cloves or anise, sometimes rinsing with wine or vinegar. But in a world where hygiene was patchwork at best, morning breath was a permanent guest. Here's a wonderfully weird fringe belief to end on. In some cultures, people thought kissing someone with tooth pain could help draw out the ache. Like some kind of intimate exorcism. There were even rituals where the afflicted would whisper their pain into a tree or stone, hoping to transfer it. It's strangely poetic if you ignore the part where no one brushed their teeth beforehand. So you finish scraping your teeth with your trusty twig, spit discreetly into the fireplace, and go on with your day. Breath vaguely pine-scented, gums slightly bleeding but feeling marginally fresher than when you woke up. Just don't smile too wide. Someone might see that one incisor turning black and start reciting last rites. And next, we're heading deep, literally, into the world beneath medieval homes, the latrines, cesspits, and the men who made a living wading through human waste. Yes, you're going to meet the unsung heroes of the Middle Ages. Grab your nose and steel your stomach. It's pit time. Okay, you've braved the twig brushing, endured the group tub, and made peace with the idea of salt as skincare, but now it's time to descend. Literally, down into the stink-choked heart of medieval sanitation, or what passed for it. We're going underground, beneath castles and cottages, into a place where nightmares ferment and the air is thick enough to chew. Welcome to the world of medieval latrines and cesspits, where every bodily function had a destination, and some unfortunate soul had the job of managing it. Let's start with the basics. If you lived in a castle or a monastery, and we're talking best case scenario, you might have access to a guardrobe. Sounds elegant, right? Like a wardrobe for guards? Not quite. A guardrobe was essentially a vertical shaft built into the outer wall of a structure. You'd sit on a wooden plank with a hole cut into it, do your business, and let gravity carry your offerings down the chute, where they'd plop out the other side of the wall and hopefully into a ditch or moat. Yes, that moat. That castle defence water feature, moat. It wasn't just full of frogs and dreams, it was also brimming with centuries of noble poop. And for the peasantry, no shafts, no moats, just the good old-fashioned cesspit. Picture a shallow pit dug behind the home, lined with stones if the family was feeling fancy. You do your business there, cover it with a bit of dirt or straw and hope it doesn't attract too many flies. Once it filled up, and it always did, you either dug a new one or had it emptied. By whom, you ask? Oh, you're going to love this. By Gong farmers. Now let's take a moment for the Gong farmer, possibly the worst job title in history, and undeniably one of the most disgusting, yet essential professions of the Middle Ages. Gong farmers were the folks who got paid to shovel out cesspits, latrines, and all the fermented horror that came with them. They worked at night, partly to keep the smell away from daily life, partly because their job was considered so offensive they were discouraged from appearing in public during normal hours. Imagine being so gross your job comes with a curfew. You, dear traveller, would not want to be a Gong farmer. It was dangerous, soul-crushing work. The pits they cleaned out were often filled with noxious gases, methane, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide. And yes, those could build up and explode, or suffocate you, or cause spontaneous unconsciousness and death if you stayed in too long. Death by poo fume. It happened, more than once. But strangely enough, being a Gong farmer paid well, like suspiciously well. These folks were compensated with hazard-level wages because no one else wanted the job, and it was critical to the health of any populated area. If the cesspits weren't emptied, disease would spread even faster than usual. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid, all your favourite bowel-based nightmares, loved nothing more than an overflowing latrine next to a bread market. Now let's go back to those castle guardrobes for a second, because while the chutes were convenient, they weren't exactly effective. The waste might drop into a moat or pile up in a pit, but no one was cleaning it regularly. Not unless someone got desperate. The stench was constant. Castle walls could reek, especially in the summer. Some clever builders tried to design angled chutes, or create draft towers to help vent out the smell. Others just hoped the wind blew in the right direction. Here's a fun fringe fact. Some castles placed herbs like mint, lavender or rosemary near their latrine areas to try and mask the smell. Not to clean it, just to fool your nose. So when you visited the Lord's private privy, you'd be greeted by a bouquet of conflicting aromas, lavender petals and week-old stew runoff, and then there were chamber pots. You know, for indoor emergencies. Every home had one. Simple ceramic or wooden bowls, sometimes even pewter if you were wealthy and extra misguided. People would do their business into it, often in the middle of the night, and in the morning toss the contents out the window, ideally into the gutter, realistically onto the street, sometimes with a yell of warning, "Garde low!" Watch out for the water, but not always. And that water, not water. You'd step outside only to be greeted by a warm surprise from above. Medieval cities were essentially obstacle courses of airborne waste. There's scholarly debate around how effective medieval sanitation systems really were. Some urban centres, like London or Paris, had rudimentary waste management in place by the 13th and 14th centuries. Officials would appoint people to monitor street cleanliness, fine households that let cesspits overflow, and even regulate latrine construction. But enforcement was spotty at best, and corruption was rampant. If your neighbour's pit was oozing into your foundation, tough luck, unless you had the silver to bribe a magistrate. But back in your humble home, the situation is simpler. You dig a new pit when the old one fills up. You line it with straw, maybe toss in some ash to keep the smell down. If you're lucky, the local Gong farmer swings by once a month. If you're unlucky, the smell reaches your neighbour's door, and they accidentally toss their own waste in retaliation. It's a quiet war of stink. And yet amid all this, people just adapted. You got used to the smell. You avoided walking near certain corners. Children were taught to recognise the squelch of a full cesspit from a young age. Your sense of disgust calibrated to a whole different scale. Rotten cabbage? Mildly unpleasant? Chamber pot surprise? Tuesday. The sheer normalcy of it all is maybe the wildest part. This wasn't seen as apocalyptic filth. It was just daily life. You knew when the Gong farmer made his rounds. You kept your chamber pot in a designated corner. You offered guests a linen curtain for privacy when they squatted over the pit. The infrastructure was primitive, but it existed. Just very, very low tech. So the next time you're sitting in a pristine tiled bathroom, scrolling your phone and listening to lo-fi beats, just remember, not so long ago someone in your ancestral line was squatting over a wooden board, hoping the wind didn't shift while a stranger with a shovel gagged his way through your backyard pit. Sweet dreams. Coming up next, we hit the cobblestone streets of medieval cities, where what didn't go into a cesspit just ended up underfoot. Open your windows, if you dare. So you've now survived the latrine labyrinth, sidestepped chamber pot air raids, and met the noble, nausea-proof Gong farmer. But don't get too comfortable. Because while some medieval waste ended up in pits, a lot of it didn't. Some of it went straight onto the cobbled arteries of medieval towns, into the open, into the gutters, and under your boots. That's right. Tonight, we're strolling the medieval street. And trust me, you'll want to keep your mouth closed. Let's say it's mid-morning. You leave your cottage to run a few errands. Maybe grab some onions from the market, chat with the cooper about a leaky barrel, or just wander aimlessly like people do when they need to pretend they're being productive. First thing you notice? The smell. It's not one thing, it's layers. Manure, rotting vegetables, fish guts, smoke, stale beer, and just the faintest hint of decomposing something. You can't quite place it, but it's there. A signature scent of medieval life. Eau de misery. The street is narrow, maybe 6 to 10 feet wide, and you're sharing it with absolutely everyone. Pedestrians, oxen carts, market vendors, stray dogs, chickens, and the occasional pig on a leash. There's a central drainage trench, or kennel as it was often called, running right down the middle, and this little channel is your town's best attempt at sanitation. In theory, rainwater and grey water flow down the trench, taking refuse with it. In practice, it's a sluggish, bubbling soup of everything that didn't make it to a latrine. Urine, food scraps, spoiled wine, fish scales, blood from the butcher's stall, and the odd human surprise. You try not to step too close. Everyone walks with a slight lean to avoid slipping into the filth. You develop a street-smart shuffle, deliberate, slow, and always watching where you plant your feet. Because one false step and it's not just your shoe that's ruined, it's your dignity. Now, people didn't just accept this mess, they worked around it. Some cities had laws against throwing refuse into the street, on paper. In reality, if it was between a trip to the town dump, which might be miles away, and flinging old stew out the window, guess what most folks did? And if you were lucky enough to have a servant, that job probably fell on them. Early morning hours were often spent cleaning thresholds, sweeping front steps, and pushing waste into the central trench. Not because people were especially hygienic, but because they didn't want the smell seeping through their walls, or attracting rats, or bringing shame to the family name. And then there's rain. Oh, rain. A cleansing blessing in theory, but in medieval towns it was chaos. When it rained, the central trench filled up and overflowed. Filth ran in rivulets through the streets. Your boots sank into soft patches. Your cloak dragged through puddles that were, let's say, mysterious. If the downpour was heavy enough, it could carry refuse right into homes built too close to street level. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night and realizing your kitchen floor is now a river of shared humanity. Good morning! And yet, street cleaning was a real thing. City authorities paid people to remove larger waste piles. In London, for example, they hired rakers, men with long-handled tools who would collect the mess and cart it away. But away usually meant the nearest empty field, ditch, or riverbank. The Thames was an open sewer for centuries. Other rivers fared no better. So yeah, the waste left your sight, but not your ecosystem. Here's a particularly disturbing fringe fact. In some places, fish markets were set up right next to street drainage trenches. You'd have fresh fish on one side, murky death sludge on the other. Vendors would rinse fish in buckets of water and let the runoff drain into the same trench. Cross-contamination wasn't just common. It was built into the infrastructure. Enjoy your plague salmon. Animals, of course, made it worse. Urban areas were filled with pigs, chickens, goats, and stray dogs. Pigs were especially popular because they ate garbage. But pigs are also, let's face it, walking biohazards. They'd root through the waste, eat who knows what, and then trot into the market square like they owned the place. If you weren't careful, you might trip over one in the street and land face first in medieval fondue. Not ideal. Now, here's where it gets a little sad. Children played in these streets. They didn't have playgrounds or sanitised backyards. They had the alley behind the butcher's shop and the corner next to the fishmonger's stall. You'd see them chasing hoops, tossing pebbles, laughing and yelling, with bare feet slapping against cobblestones slick with runoff. Cuts, scrapes, bruises, constant. Infections, highly likely. But when everyone lives in the same stink, it becomes background noise. There's some scholarly debate about how aware medieval people were of sanitation dangers. Many believe they understood some connection between filth and disease. Not germs, exactly. Germ theory didn't come around until much later, but the idea that foul air, or miasma, could sicken you. That's why so many homes hung herbs or burned incense indoors, to keep the bad air out. It didn't do much, but the intent was there. You can see the beginnings of hygiene culture, just not fully formed yet. In some parts of Europe, especially later in the medieval period, there were even rudimentary street cleaning systems. Town councils passed ordinances requiring residents to keep their doorstep areas clean. Violators could be fined, but enforcement varied wildly. It all came down to who lived where and how much influence they had. Wealthy areas were cleaner. Poorer ones, well, they got the runoff. Here's a slightly absurd fringe image to leave you with. There were reports of people in fine clothes walking with little boys holding umbrellas, not to protect them from rain, but to guard against sudden droppings from above. Human ones. Yep. Rich people hired child bodyguards against airborne feces. Put that on your resume. So as you finally make it home, boots heavy with God knows what and your nose permanently offended, you sit down, peel off your socks, and realise the smell won't come out for days. It's in your clothes, your hair, your soul, and the worst part, you're used to it. This is life. Next time, we'll talk about something a little closer to your body. How laundry worked, how often clothes were cleaned, and why fashion in the Middle Ages was as much about surviving the stench as it was looking stylish. Don't pack away that wool tunic just yet, we've got grime to explore. Let's pause and take a deep inhale. No, wait, actually, don't do that. Not yet. Because we're still out here in the open air of a medieval town, and it's time to talk about one of the most unforgettable, inescapable parts of medieval life. The smell. The sheer, omnipresent, bone-deep stench of it all. You think you've smelled bad things? Wet socks, gym bags, someone microwaving fish in an office kitchen? Amateur hour. The medieval city was a full-on olfactory assault, and the nose, poor thing, had nowhere to hide. It hits you the moment you step outside, or honestly it probably never leaves. Inside your home is a mix of burning peat, damp wool, and that faint but familiar smell of your own body, which hasn't seen soap in a month. Outside? Multiply that by a few hundred other bodies, some pigs, an open cesspit, a few fish heads on the ground, and the sour stink of ale gone wrong. Then let it simmer in the sun. That's your town's default fragrance. The air is thick with it. Not in a metaphorical way, in the actual, breathable, slightly chewy sense. On hot summer days, it feels like you're walking through soup made of compost and regret. The gutters, which double as sewer lines and trash chutes, are bubbling. There's a dead dog slowly becoming part of the street. Someone's cooking onions, another is skinning a rabbit. And the tanner down the street is boiling animal hides in urine and lime. Oh yes, the tanner. Let's talk about that guy. He's not just unpopular at parties, he can't go to them. Most towns forced tanners and fullers, who processed cloth using things like urine and dung, to work outside city walls. Not for moral reasons, just because they reeked so badly it made people faint. A tanner's yard was essentially a perfume lab from hell. Rotting flesh, caustic chemicals, animal brain matter, all bubbling in giant vats. These were the people who made your leather shoes and your cloaks, by the way. Fashion really was pain. Now you might wonder how people could stand it. Did they just not notice the smell? Well, yes and no. Like anyone, they adjusted. When everyone stinks and the streets constantly reek of smoke and waste, your brain does a little self-preservation trick and tunes it out. Kind of like how you stop hearing the ticking clock in your room, or how you stop noticing your roommate's weird foot lotion smell. You're just nose numb. That said, they did try to fight back. People hung bunches of herbs around their necks, or wore little scented pouches called pomanders. These were filled with things like cloves, nutmeg, or rosemary. Any strong smell that could overpower the streets. Think of them as medieval air fresheners you wore like jewellery. Some folks even shoved herbs up their nostrils or inside masks to ward off bad airs, which they believed could make you sick. Miasma theory, basically the idea that bad smells cause disease, was widespread. It wasn't accurate, but it was the best explanation they had. And honestly, it's not a wild guess. If you smell something foul, odds are it's connected to rot, bacteria, or some other hazard, so keeping stink at bay felt like survival. Now here's a curious fringe fact. Some nobles actually had perfumed gloves and handkerchiefs that they would hold to their face while walking in public. Not to seem mysterious or aristocratic, though that was a bonus, but just to survive a walk through town without vomiting. Some wealthy women even carried small, hollow apples filled with crushed flowers or spices. They'd lift these pomanders to their nose when things got especially pungent. And get this, in some parts of Europe, public health laws required butchers to dispose of animal waste outside the city walls or during certain hours to minimise stench. It worked in theory, but enforcement was tricky. By mid-afternoon, the butcher's lane usually reeked like blood pudding left out in the sun. Rats loved it. Dogs loved it. People? Not so much. And yet, for all the daily stink, perfume was not especially popular among common folks. Too expensive. Too fancy. If you were a peasant, your version of scent control was rubbing yourself with herbs, maybe airing out your tunic on a windy day, or just embracing the musk. Clean didn't always mean perfumed, it just meant less offensive. Some people even believed strong artificial scents could make you sick by overwhelming your senses, so even if you had access to oils or perfumes, you used them sparingly. Here's a bit of an open scholarly debate though. Were people truly indifferent to the smell, or just resigned? Some argue that medieval folks had a totally different olfactory culture, that they were more tolerant, even appreciative, of certain earthy smells. Others suggest they hated it as much as we would, but with no realistic alternatives they learned to shrug and breathe through their mouths. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. If you grew up around dung fires and sweat-soaked wool, then yes, a little urine in the street probably didn't faze you. But step inside a cathedral filled with incense and you might feel a moment of actual sensory bliss. Incense, by the way, was the medieval gold standard of smell management, especially in religious settings. Churches burned it constantly, not just for spiritual reasons, but because a packed congregation of unwashed souls needed something to compete with their combined aroma. Mass could be long, and you didn't want people passing out in the pews. Now let's say you come home after a long day dodging waste and pig droppings. Your nose is numb, your boots are ruined, but you're alive. You change into your relaxation tunic, which smells almost identical to your daytime tunic, and you sit by the fire. The smell of your home? Smoke, damp cloth, stew, a little mildew. But there's something comforting in it. You've built your tolerance, maybe even nostalgia. And as awful as the streets might be, this is your oasis. Tomorrow, though, laundry day. And no, it won't help the smell much, but it's a start. So next up, we're going to dig into medieval laundry methods, how often people actually cleaned their clothes, and what fresh really meant when your water came from the same river your neighbour's cow just pooped in. Welcome to Laundry Day Medieval Edition, a sacred ritual of soaking, scrubbing and slowly surrendering to the fact that clean is a wildly flexible term. You've just spent a week, or 2, or 5, wearing the same wool tunic, trudging through waste-filled streets, sweating through your layers, maybe even catching some fleas along the way. Now it's time to freshen up. Except laundry isn't a daily convenience. It's an ordeal. A full body, full day, maybe full week kind of affair. And if you're picturing a basket of white linen spinning gently in suds, I'm going to have to crush that dream right here and now. First, let's talk frequency. How often did people wash their clothes? Not often. Certainly not daily, and not weekly, unless you were unusually ambitious or someone spilled something unspeakable on your only set of trousers. Laundry was labour-intensive, time-consuming, and involved dragging heavy wet cloth from one miserable place to another. If you were poor, you likely had just 1 or 2 outfits. So laundry day often meant airing out your tunic on a rock while hoping the breeze does something. Richer folks might own multiple garments and cycle them out more frequently, but even then, full-on washing was rare. You start by collecting your clothes, all of them, because you're not doing this again for another few weeks. If you're lucky, your town has a stream or river nearby. If you're unlucky, you're stuck with rainwater barrels, wells, or even hauling water from the same stream where someone just bathed their horse, and a child relieved themselves 5 minutes ago. The water quality, dubious at best, but it's wet and that's what counts. You haul your bundle to the nearest washing site. This might be a public area by the riverbank or a communal washhouse if your town's progressive enough to have one. There you'll find a group of equally tired-looking people, mostly women, elbow deep in greyish water, whacking fabric against flat stones and trading gossip. These places were less about hygiene and more about socialising with a side of mildew. Now to the actual washing. You don't have detergent, of course. Instead, you use a slurry made of soap, usually the same caustic lye-based brick we mentioned earlier, grated into bits and mixed with water. Or you go rustic and rub the clothes with ashes, sand, or even fermented urine. Yes, old urine. Known as lant, it was a surprisingly common cleaning agent. Why? Because it breaks down into ammonia, which is an effective grease cutter. Just don't think too hard about it while you're sudsing up your socks. You dip your tunic, scrub it with the rough edge of a flat rock, beat it a few times like it owes you money, and then rinse it in the slightly less cloudy part of the stream. If you're ambitious, you boil your linens, particularly underclothes or bedsheets, in a giant pot over the fire. This requires fuel, time, and someone willing to stir the pot of semi-clean future laundry like it's a soup from the 9th circle of hell. And then comes drying. There are no dryers, obviously. Clothes are draped over bushes, hung from tree limbs, laid across fences or stretched between 2 poles. And here's the real kicker. Drying takes forever. Medieval fabrics, especially wool and heavy linen, hold water like a sponge. And if the weather's damp, congratulations. Your laundry now smells worse than it did before. Wet wool mixed with smoke and river funk? Delicious. Now here's a weirdly charming fringe fact. Some people would sprinkle dried herbs or flower petals into their wash water, or rub them into the clothes during the rinse to help mask unpleasant smells. Not to cleanse really, just to make it tolerable. Imagine a shirt that smells like both lavender and foot, somehow worse than just foot. As you wring out your last pair of hose, arms aching and hands raw, you realise something unsettling. Your clean clothes are still kind of dirty. The stains aren't gone. The smell is mostly different, not better. And now your arms are wet, your back hurts, and a pig just knocked over your drying sheet. It's a demoralising process. Of course, wealthy people didn't do this themselves. They had laundresses, usually women hired or enslaved to handle the laundry of large households. These laundresses were expected to not only wash the clothes, but to return them neatly folded, dried, and often scented. In some cases, garments were starched using boiled wheat or flour paste to help them hold shape. A doublet stiff with starch was a status symbol. It meant you had enough clean clothes to have some ruined by fashion. And speaking of starch, here's a bonus fringe fact. Certain garments, like ruffs and collars, were starched so heavily they could stand on their own, making them both impractical and wildly uncomfortable. The price of style? Neck rash. There's a scholarly debate about just how clean medieval people actually wanted their clothes. Some argue that people were used to visible dirt and stains and didn't care unless it interfered with social standing. Others suggest that while visible grime was tolerated, odours were more offensive, hence the obsession with covering garments in herbs or smoke. Some even burned incense near their wardrobes, because if your tunic smells like sandalwood, maybe people won't notice that it's also stiff with last year's turnip stew. So you finally pack up your laundry, still damp, questionably improved, and head home. If you're careful, you avoid dragging it through the same mud you washed off. If you're not, well, that's next month's problem. You hang it near the fire, where it will take a few more hours to dry, and then you fall onto your itchy straw mattress with the kind of exhaustion only medieval chores can bring. But as your eyes close, you feel slightly more civilized. The shirt you'll wear tomorrow is slightly less crusty. Your hose are no longer standing up by themselves. And there's a tiny sprig of rosemary tucked into your collar to prove you gave it an honest effort. It's not perfect, but it's the closest you've come to clean in weeks. Coming up next, we'll zoom in on the scalp and start picking through the hidden horrors of medieval hair care. Lice, fleas, scabs, wigs, and why shaving it all off was sometimes the only solution. Hope you're not itchy yet. You will be. Let's get uncomfortably close now, right up against the scalp. You've endured the grime of the streets, the misery of medieval laundry day, and the olfactory trauma of the public square. But under all those layers of wool and linen, there's another ecosystem thriving. Welcome to the itchiest part of medieval life, hair care, or rather, the battle against lice, fleas, scabs, nits, and whatever else had the nerve to take up residence on your scalp. And let's be very clear, this isn't just a poor people problem. Everyone itched. Rich, poor, pious, sinful. If you had hair, something was probably crawling in it. So you wake up in your humble cottage. Your straw mattress is full of dust and probably a few friends, fleas mostly, and your scalp is on fire. Not from shampoo, not from an overzealous hair dye job. No, this is good old-fashioned medieval lice. You scratch and then scratch some more and still they persist. You've got a full colony up there. You're now the mayor of Luceville. Now if you think lice are just annoying little bugs, allow me to ruin your evening. They lay eggs, nits, glued right to the base of your hair shafts. Those hatch into more lice, and if left untreated, which, spoiler, they usually are, the irritation can lead to raw skin, scabs, and infections. And because you sleep beside your family, maybe even share a bed with your siblings or spouse, congratulations! Now everyone gets to itch. It's a group activity. Your first weapon is the comb, and not just any comb, a knit comb, a fine-toothed little tool made from wood, bone, or metal, specifically designed to drag through hair and pull out lice and their eggs. It hurts, it's slow, and it doesn't always work. So, some people resort to the scorched earth tactic. Shave it all off. That's right. Complete head shaving was surprisingly common, especially in monasteries or among the upper classes who could afford wigs. If you couldn't get the lice out, you got rid of the habitat entirely. Monks often had their heads shaved into tonsures, not just for religious humility, but also because it was way easier to clean a bald patch than a full head of medieval dreadlocks. Noblewomen sometimes did it too, especially if they were wearing elaborate headgear or wigs. Wigs, by the way, came with their own hygiene nightmares, but at least they were detachable. If you were determined to keep your hair, you had options. They weren't great options, but they existed. People tried herbal rinses made with rosemary, lavender, mint or rue, plants believed to repel parasites. Some even soaked their hair in vinegar or strong alcohol to kill off the bugs. Did it work? Sort of. Sometimes it just left your scalp burning and the lice drunk. And here's a fringe fact that might surprise you. Medieval folks didn't wash their hair very often. Not because they didn't care, but because washing hair was a hassle. Soap was harsh, water wasn't always available, and drying long hair could take ages. Plus, some believed frequent hair washing could cause illness by opening the pores on your scalp. So many people just combed it out, braided it, and hoped the bugs would get bored and leave. They never did. You head into town and glance at the heads around you. Women's hair is braided, coiled, or tucked under wimples and veils. Men wear theirs shoulder length or bobbed, sometimes tucked under hoods. Hats are everywhere, not just for fashion, but as a barrier between the world and your scalp situation. If someone starts scratching furiously in public, no one blinks. It's just part of the routine. Of course, wealthier folks outsourced their scalp problems. They had servants whose job it was to comb their hair daily. This wasn't just grooming, it was lice control. Some noble households kept records of combing sessions and treated combs as prized tools. In certain circles, having a servant with a gentle hand and a keen eye for nits was as essential as having a good cook. There's a scholarly debate about just how widespread and accepted lice were. Some argue that people were so used to them, they didn't even consider it a problem, just a fact of life. Others point to historical texts and personal letters that describe lice with disgust, indicating that people did find them revolting, even if they couldn't always avoid them. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere in between. You hated them, sure, but you didn't expect to live lice-free unless you were rich, bald, or very lucky. And if you think head lice were the end of it, think again. There were also body lice, which lived in the seams of your clothing and came out at night to feed. Like tiny vampires, but infinitely itchier. They were harder to spot and often confused with bedbugs, which, spoiler again, also existed and were equally awful. The cure? Boiling your clothes? But as we just discussed, a laundry was a once-in-a-while ordeal, so most people just scratched and carried on. Fleas were just as bad. They lived in the straw of your mattress, in your cloak, in the folds of your hose. They weren't picky, and they were resilient. People tried hanging herbs in their bedding, brushing off their clothing, or shaking out their cloaks every morning. But the truth is, if you were warm-blooded and breathing, you were a target. And these fleas, they weren't just annoying, they were deadly. Yep, these were the very same fleas that helped transmit the Black Death. So every itch on your ankle could, in theory, be the beginning of something really dramatic. Now, here's a quirky fringe practice that actually sounds kind of sweet. Mothers would sometimes spend time nitpicking their children's hair by hand, carefully going through each strand and crushing nits between their nails. It was intimate, time-consuming, and yes, kind of gross. But also one of the few ways to keep your family from turning into a walking bug colony. Think of it like bonding time with bonus hygiene. So after a full day of scratching, combing and swatting, you sit by the hearth, scalp sore, hair braided tight, and you count your victories. You found 3 adult lice, 2 nests of eggs, and a flea the size of a grain of rice. Not bad. You boil your comb in the fire kettle, wrap your head in a scarf and pray that tonight your mattress hasn't become a flea rave. Because tomorrow, you're heading back out into a world where bugs don't just survive, they thrive. And next time, we'll move from your head to your stomach and figure out why drinking water in the Middle Ages was basically asking for a parasite to move in rent-free. Don't sip anything just yet. You might want to wait until you hear about the town well, so your scalp is crawling, your tunic still smells faintly of vinegar-soaked laundry, and your boots have seen things that cannot be unseen. You could really use a drink. Something cool. Something refreshing. Something that doesn't taste like warm hay and regret. But here's the thing. If you lived in medieval Europe, grabbing a glass of water wasn't just a simple part of your day. It was a health hazard, a public experiment in immune system roulette. Drinking water in the Middle Ages. It was like playing a medieval version of Russian roulette, except every chamber might be loaded with dysentery. Let's get one thing straight. People did drink water. It's not like everyone walked around refusing to touch the stuff. But it was approached with caution. You see a wooden bucket by the door filled with water drawn from the local well. You eye it suspiciously. It's slightly cloudy. There's something floating in it that might be a leaf or might be an insect larva. And you're thirsty, but you're also tired of having gastrointestinal emergencies every time you take a sip. Decisions. The core problem was contamination. Wells in medieval towns were often dug near cesspits, latrines, or areas where people dumped waste. Town planning wasn't exactly scientific. The idea that human and animal waste might seep into the water table wasn't yet part of common understanding, so a well that looked clean and cool could easily be full of invisible parasites or bacteria, just waiting to turn your stomach into a battlefield. A lot of people just accepted chronic stomach pain and diarrhea as part of life. It wasn't unusual to wake up feeling slightly poisoned. You just hoped you wouldn't have to sprint to the latrine more than 4 or 5 times that day. That's where ale comes in, or wine if you were lucky. Medieval people didn't just drink alcohol to party, they drank it to stay alive. Low-alcohol beer, known as small beer, was a daily staple. Brewed quickly, low in alcohol content and safer than water, it became the drink of choice for children and adults alike. It wasn't going to get you drunk, but it also wasn't going to send you running for the nearest privy. It was your hydration strategy. If you saw someone sipping beer at breakfast, that wasn't weird, it was smart. Now let's walk through a medieval brewing session. You start by boiling water and mixing it with malted barley, maybe a few herbs or hops if you're lucky. You ferment it for a short time, strain out the solids, and what you get is a cloudy, warmish beverage that's vaguely sour but safer than whatever's lurking in your well. Brewing was often done at home, especially in villages. Alewives, women who specialised in small batch brewing, were a common sight. They sold their beer in jugs from the front of their houses, and some even developed reputations for producing the cleanest or least chunky brew. You know, medieval Yelp reviews. In cities, public breweries handled larger quantities. Monasteries also became key producers of beer and wine, which they used in religious ceremonies and for sale. Monks had the time, resources, and general cleanliness to produce beverages that didn't kill you. There's even evidence that some monasteries made stronger beers as a kind of liquid bread. Calories in a cup, especially useful during fasting. Wine was more expensive and mostly for the upper classes, especially in Northern Europe where grapes didn't grow as easily. It was often watered down or mixed with spices to cover spoilage. If you were rich, you had access to imported wine, stored in barrels that were less likely to be contaminated. If you were poor, you got local stuff that might taste like fermented vinegar with notes of foot. And here's a quirky fringe detail for you. Some people, in an effort to clean their drinking water, would plunge a red-hot iron poker into it. Not to boil the water completely, just to give it a shock of heat. Others added herbs or even a splash of vinegar, believing that this could neutralise the invisible bad airs or poisons. There were even folk remedies involving placing a silver coin in a cup to purify the contents. Did it work? Not really. But it made people feel better, and honestly that's half the battle. Now there's a scholarly debate about just how unsafe medieval water really was. Some historians argue that people learned over time to identify good wells and avoid obviously dirty ones. Others suggest that the overwhelming evidence of widespread intestinal disease points to consistent contamination. Truth is, even a safe well could be ruined by a few bad decisions, like building a tannery next door or letting livestock wander freely. And speaking of livestock, oh yes, they drank from the same sources. A town's water supply wasn't exactly fenced off. Horses, pigs, dogs, they all took their turns at the local stream or well, leaving behind gifts. And if you think anyone was filtering that water before it got ladled into your cup, think again. Maybe you ran it through a piece of cloth. Maybe you didn't. Maybe your cloth was already full of other questionable material. You win some, you lose most. So if you didn't want to drink water or couldn't afford beer, you had a few alternatives. Weak wine, thin porridge broth, or watered down milk if your cow wasn't currently riddled with disease. Herbal infusions were also a thing. Basically medieval tea made from boiled leaves, roots or flowers. These might have offered some health benefits, especially if boiled long enough to kill off pathogens. But they weren't common in the daily diet unless you were sick, rich or both. Now picture yourself at a tavern. You order a jug of ale. The mug is wooden, slightly splintered and still warm from the last guy who used it. You sip. It's sour, slightly yeasty and weirdly chewy. But it doesn't make your stomach cramp instantly, so you call it a win. You raise a toast to survival, to hydration, and to the genius of brewing as a substitute for water. Everyone clinks their mugs. No one asks for ice. And that, dear listener, is why medieval Europe didn't run on Dunkin'. It ran on beer. Hydration was a full-time job, and anything safer than the town well was liquid gold. Up next, we'll dive into the Black Death and its not-so-clean relationship with the hygiene horrors we've been exploring. Plague, panic, filth, and fleas. Because nothing says Middle Ages quite like a pandemic with bonus superstition. So you've been living in a haze of filth, scratching lice, sipping lukewarm ale because the water might kill you. And now you're about to face something that makes everything before seem like a spa weekend. That's right. The Black Death has arrived. Plague time. It's the 14th century and things are about to get a lot worse. And given everything you've already endured, that's saying something. Imagine the scene. It's summer, and your town is a little busier than usual. People are acting strange. Whispers on the street. Priests looking more anxious than holy, and that weird guy down the road hasn't been seen in days. Then the bell tolls. Again. And again. And then you hear it. Someone muttering. Another one gone. You don't think much of it until your neighbour's house is boarded shut overnight and someone scrawls a red mark on the door. Suddenly, everyone's face changes. The fear rolls in like fog. You're living in a time when the world doesn't understand germs or bacteria, but they do understand patterns, and they're starting to notice a very dark, very consistent one. First, someone gets a headache. Then they feel feverish, start vomiting, and within days, sometimes hours, their body breaks out in painful swellings, usually under the arms or in the groin. Blackened lumps, buboes, and then they die. Fast. We now know that the Black Death, or bubonic plague, was primarily spread by fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, hitching rides on rats. But medieval folks didn't know that. Their world was built on guesswork, superstition, and theology. To them, it could have been punishment from God, bad air, the alignment of the planets, or even the Jews poisoning the wells, an accusation that led to horrific violence and mass killings across Europe. And now, let's address the big, oozing elephant in the room: hygiene. No, poor hygiene didn't cause the plague, but it absolutely helped it spread like wildfire. Towns were perfect breeding grounds. Waste in the streets, close-packed housing, poor ventilation, stagnant water, livestock everywhere. It was a literal buffet for disease. Rats scurried freely through homes, granaries and markets. Fleas hopped off rodents onto humans without anyone noticing. Add in a few merchant ships bringing infected rats into port and boom, you've got a continent-wide disaster. Some tried to flee to the countryside, but they brought the fleas with them. Others locked themselves inside their homes. A few brave or doomed souls stayed behind to care for the sick. Most just waited. The death rate was catastrophic. Estimates range from 1/3 to half the population of Europe. That's tens of millions of people. Whole towns vanished. Cities emptied. Fields went unharvested because there were no workers left to reap them. And yet, some people believed cleanliness could help. Not medical cleanliness, but moral cleanliness. You start seeing flagellants, groups of religious zealots parading through towns, whipping themselves bloody in hopes of earning divine mercy. Bathhouses are shut down. Not because people want to stay dirty, but because they're afraid the steam will open their pores and let in the bad air. Remember that miasma theory? It's running the show now. People hang herbs and spices in doorways, burn incense, sprinkle vinegar on the floors, anything to purify the air. Here's a weird and slightly depressing fringe fact. Some people believed strong smells could protect you from the plague. So they walked around holding rotten fruit, sulphur, or even dead animals under their noses. Yep, you read that right. Some people tried to fight the smell of death with more death. It didn't help, but it really captured the medieval vibe. The plague doctors arrive, those beaked-robed figures you've seen in creepy Halloween masks. The masks were filled with aromatic herbs to filter the air, and their long coats were meant to protect them from disease. In theory. But most of these doctors weren't trained physicians. Many were just desperate volunteers or low-ranking officials trying not to die. Their presence was more symbolic than useful. Still, if you saw one walking your street, it meant death was in the air. And then there's the aftermath. The plague didn't just kill people, it destabilized everything. Religious faith was shaken. Social structures broke down. Families abandoned their own sick members. With so many dead, wages went up for surviving workers. Entire villages were left empty. People stopped trusting each other. No one knew who might be next. And when it finally faded, when the worst of it passed, you were left with the staggering silence of loss and a communal trauma that echoed for generations. Scholars continue to debate just how much medieval hygiene practices contributed to the spread. Some argue that people were already taking precautions like quarantines before the word even existed. Others say the sheer filth of cities made plague inevitable once it arrived. The truth, again, probably lies in the messiest middle ground. A world teetering on the edge of disaster, pushed over by disease and held there by ignorance. You, having survived, somehow, walk down a street that looks completely different. It's quieter. Shops are closed. The air is still. Not clean exactly, but the chaos has gone mute. You hold your scarf to your face, not because it helps, but because it makes you feel safer. A few people sweep the doorsteps. Someone throws a bucket of water into the gutter, trying to rinse away more than just physical dirt. Everyone looks thinner, wearier, changed. And the plague, it doesn't disappear. It returns again and again in smaller waves for centuries. But the Black Death was the worst of it, the first and the most brutal, and you were there for it, scratching, sweating, surviving. Now that the worst has passed, we'll take a deep breath and look at how people tried to mask the smells, the filth, and the death itself, with perfume, herbs, and more questionable medical practices that were half hygiene, half superstition. Scent becomes a shield. So prepare your nostrils. We're diving into the world of medieval aromatherapy, whether it worked or not. So, you've survived the Black Death. Barely. You're pale, half deaf from all the funeral bells, and you've aged emotionally about 40 years in 6 months. But you're alive. Congratulations. Now the question becomes, how do you protect yourself from whatever horror comes next? If you're a medieval European, the answer is obvious. Scent. That's right. Welcome to the golden age of medieval aromatherapy, where perfume is less about attracting suitors and more about repelling death, or at least the smell of it. You've probably already got a little herb pouch tucked into your clothing, maybe some dried lavender or mint. Nothing fancy, just enough to keep the world from hitting your nose at full force. But now, in a world freshly traumatized by plague, that pouch becomes your most valuable accessory. If you can't keep the streets clean, you can at least filter the air that reaches your brain. Well, that's the idea anyway. Let's back up. The dominant medical theory of the time, as we touched on before, was miasma, the belief that disease spread through bad smells or corrupted air. It sounds wild now, but to the medieval mind it made perfect sense. The sick smelled bad. So did rotting corpses. So did the streets when they overflowed with waste. Clearly there was a connection. And if bad air made you sick, then it stood to reason that good air might protect you. Enter perfume, not as a cosmetic luxury, but as literal survival gear. You walk into a market and suddenly you're surrounded by the 14th century version of a fragrance aisle. Vendors hawk dried herbs, scented oils, flower waters, incense sticks, and something called sweet bags. Little satchels filled with cloves, rose petals, cinnamon, and anything else that smells stronger than the butcher's runoff. People hang them from belts, hide them in sleeves, or stuff them into pillows. It's not subtle. You're walking around in a giant potpourri sachet, but you're hoping it keeps the bad air, and therefore the plague, away. The really dedicated carry pomanders, round, perforated containers made of silver or brass, filled with a pungent blend of ingredients and often worn like a necklace or clipped to a belt. Think of it as your personal scent grenade. Some even came with multiple compartments for different scents, so you could mix and match. Today, rosemary and clove. Tomorrow, cinnamon and rose. It was the medieval equivalent of switching between your fall and winter perfume collection. And this wasn't just for the rich. Peasants used scent to cope too, though theirs were less imported spice blends, and more burning local herbs in a clay bowl. People hung bunches of dried plants in doorways and windows. Rue, sage, wormwood, and marjoram were popular, not only for their strong aromas, but for their supposed protective powers. In some households, families burned branches indoors to purify the space. Incense wasn't just for church anymore, it was medicine. Here's a fringe fact to curl your toes. Some people believed you could ward off disease by sniffing the flatulence of a healthy person. Yep, that's a real thing. The idea was that foul smells could counteract other, more dangerous foul smells. Some medieval doctors even suggested keeping a goat indoors for its odour. Welcome to the world of bad plus bad equals better. Of course, if you were wealthy, your options were broader and slightly less revolting. The nobility had access to imported perfumes and oils from the Middle East and North Africa, where fragrance making was an actual science. Rosewater, sandalwood oil, myrrh and frankincense all made appearances in European courts. They were dabbed behind ears, sprinkled on linens, and used to scent bath water on those rare occasions when someone actually took a bath. Perfumed gloves were a fashion must-have among the elite. Imagine slipping on a pair of finely crafted leather gloves that smell like orange blossom and clove instead of, say, damp pigskin. It was part status symbol, part self-defense against the air. And if you were feeling especially fancy, you might even perfume your wig, because nothing says, "I've made it," like fake hair that smells like a royal garden instead of boiled rat. But let's not get too dreamy about this. Some of these concoctions were intense. One famous recipe from a plague handbook suggested boiling vinegar with rose petals, mint, rosemary and camphor, then soaking a sponge in it and carrying it around to sniff. Sound reasonable? Well, they also recommended adding crushed emeralds or unicorn horn if you had some lying around. Because why not? Science was more of a feeling. This is where we hit the scholarly debate. Did these perfumed defences actually help? Most modern historians agree that while scent-based protection didn't stop the spread of plague, it might have helped people avoid some airborne irritants, especially in a world full of smoke, mould and general decay. Plus, boiling herbs and vinegar to make infusions often meant people were also boiling their water, a subtle and unintended sanitation benefit. And psychologically, these scents probably mattered more than we give them credit for. When the world feels out of control, having a little pocket of rose-scented order can be a lifeline. You might not be able to stop death from knocking on your neighbour's door, but you can fill your room with the smell of cloves and convince yourself you're doing something useful. It's human, it's desperate, and it's kind of beautiful in a tragic lavender-scented way. Even medical practitioners bought into it. Doctors burned herbs in sick rooms to cleanse the air. Hospitals and monasteries sometimes sprinkled floral water on floors. Apothecaries made good money selling fragrance blends advertised as plague preventatives. Entire booklets were written about what smells to carry during an outbreak, with elaborate instructions about when to sniff, what to burn, and how to cleanse your home using nothing but time and determination. So here you are, walking through your plague-ravaged town, pomander swinging at your side, sleeve perfumed with a mix of vinegar and crushed herbs. You pass a pile of dead rats and barely flinch. Your scent shield is holding. Maybe it's helping, maybe it's not. But in this world of endless sickness and filth, sometimes belief is the most powerful medicine you've got. And next, we're heading into the velvet-draped, gold-encrusted halls of medieval royalty to see if all that wealth actually bought them cleaner lives. Spoiler, having servants doesn't always mean your privy smells like roses. Prepare yourself for chamber pots, perfume overload, and some very questionable royal hygiene choices. Time to raise the portcullis and slip into the perfumed corridors of power. Tonight, we're stepping out of the pig-strewn peasant lanes and into the opulent, draughty halls of medieval royalty. Gold leaf, velvet tapestries, towering hairstyles, and chamber orchestras fill the fantasy, until you catch a whiff of the truth. Because here's the dirty little secret no history book with gilded edges wants to admit. Being royal didn't mean being clean. It just meant your filth wore nicer shoes. You enter the grand hall of a medieval castle. It's impressive. Stone pillars, enormous hearths, stained glass filtering pale light across polished floors. But move past the initial sparkle, and you'll notice a less romantic detail. The smell. Not overpowering, but lingering. Like wet fur mixed with old wine and something faintly human. It's not that the place is neglected, there are servants scurrying everywhere. It's just that the entire concept of clean, in the royal world, was filtered through a lens of ritual, not sanitation. Let's start with bathing. Royals had bathtubs. Yes, wooden tubs lined with linen, sometimes fitted with metal inserts to hold heated water, and surrounded by curtains to keep out draughts and wandering eyes. When the king or queen decided to bathe, it was an event. Servants hauled buckets of hot water, scented the bath with herbs, and sometimes even played music to soothe the royal nerves. But here's the catch. It happened maybe a few times a year, if that. Daily bathing wasn't just uncommon, it was thought to be dangerous. Opening the pores invited illness, remember? So a royal might sit in scented water on holidays or before coronations, but the rest of the time they relied on layers of clothing, frequent linen changes, and rivers of perfume to cover the natural odour monarchy. And yes, they smelled better than peasants. But that's not saying much. That's like saying warm garbage smells better than hot garbage. Technically true, still rough on the nose, which brings us to perfume. Royal courts reeked of it, in every sense. Lavender sachets sewn into sleeves, rosewater dabbed onto necklines, even cinnamon oil rubbed into hair. Rooms were fumigated with incense or strewn with rushes soaked in aromatic oils. But these weren't just pleasant touches. They were necessary. Because beneath the satin and gold thread was a body that hadn't touched soap in weeks, wrapped in layers of sweat-absorbing linen and wool. And beneath that, possibly lice. Now let's talk chamber pots. Every royal had one, often crafted of porcelain or pewter, sometimes even gilded with gold. because nothing says king like pooping into a treasure. These pots were kept under chairs, tucked behind curtains, or carried discreetly by servants. If the king had to go in the middle of a long council meeting, he didn't leave the room. He just moved to a quiet corner and did his royal business. There are actual accounts of courtiers carrying on conversations while someone relieved themselves nearby. Privacy wasn't a priority. Efficiency was. And who cleaned those pots? Enter the groom of the stool, one of the most trusted and oddly prestigious positions in the English royal court. This lucky individual was in charge of assisting the king with his bathroom needs, everything from preparing the chamber pot to wiping if necessary. It sounds humiliating, but the role came with immense political power. Why? Because no one spent more private time with the king. The groom heard secrets, gained trust, could whisper advice no one else dared speak. That's medieval politics, folks. The closer you are to the throne, the closer you are to the toilet. Sleeping arrangements weren't much better. Royal beds were massive, elaborately carved, and often filled with layers of blankets, fur and linen, but they were still susceptible to fleas and lice. A queen's hairpiece might be a marvel of pearls and architecture, but it was also a 5-star resort for parasites. Wigs and headdresses were powdered and perfumed, but rarely cleaned. People often wore linen caps or coifs under their fancy headgear, swapping them out instead of washing the outer layer. So yes, the crown sparkled, but the scalp underneath, less so. And let's not forget laundry. Royals didn't do it themselves, obviously. They had entire departments, washerwomen, fullers, starchers, whose job was to clean, press and scent royal garments. Linens were washed more frequently than outer garments. Undergarments might be changed every few days. Cloaks and gowns were spot cleaned or aired out. But washing a full velvet robe, that was risky. The dyes ran, the fabric shrank. Better to just spritz it with rose water and pray. Here's a weird little fringe fact to tuck into your perfume pouch. Some nobles used vinegar-soaked sponges as early deodorant. They'd dab under their arms or on their feet to cleanse the skin. Did it work? Barely. But it smelled better than uncut armpit. Now, scholars debate how much royalty cared about cleanliness. Some argue that kings and queens saw hygiene as a sign of moral purity. Others suggest that cleanliness was strictly ceremonial, like purifying your hands before mass, but ignoring the toenail colony growing in your velvet boots. There are written records praising queens for their purity and freshness, but these may be more about symbolism than scent. After all, you didn't tell the queen she smelled like old cheese, not if you valued your head. Still, there were efforts. Some monarchs had personal bathhouses or private gardens where they could soak in herbal waters. Queen Elizabeth reportedly had her own soap made, and Louis XIV of France, while famously perfume-soaked, also owned a gold toilet. But owning fancy hygiene tools didn't mean using them regularly. Royalty had the option to be clean. They just often chose to cover the stench with silk and incense instead. So as you leave the royal chambers, past velvet drapes that have absorbed centuries of perfume, sweat and political panic, you come to a realization. Being royal in the Middle Ages meant living large, dressing fine and smelling slightly better than average. It was hygiene by proxy, by perfume, by sheer force of will. And somehow it worked. No one dared complain, not to their face anyway. Next, we'll sneak into the quiet cloisters and echoing corridors of medieval monasteries, where surprisingly some of the cleanest people in the Middle Ages were living quietly, praying daily and washing their hands more than anyone else. Bring your candle and your curiosity. It's time to meet the monks. So far, we've waded through muck, plague and perfumed privilege, but now we're stepping into a place that might, just might, offer you a brief moment of relief. Welcome to the monastery. In the middle of the chaos and filth of medieval life, these quiet, incense-scented spaces stood apart, not just in faith, but in hygiene. That's right. Among the chanting and the calligraphy, the monks were scrubbing up, washing their hands and, brace yourself, sometimes even bathing. Don't get too excited though. This wasn't a medieval version of a wellness spa. It was still the Middle Ages after all. But by comparison, the monastery was practically a 5-star hotel. Let's set the scene. You walk through the gates of a Benedictine monastery. The air immediately quieter, cooler, almost reverent. The walls are made of thick stone, the gardens carefully tended, and everything moves in a calm rhythm, no pigs snorting through the streets, no chamber pots flying from upper windows. The smell, not great, but definitely less aggressive. Herbs grow along the walls, sage, rosemary, thyme. The monks are chanting in the chapel, their bare feet padding softly along clean stone floors. And tucked in the corner of the courtyard is something you haven't seen in weeks. A wash basin. Yes, water. Fresh water. Flowing from a fountain connected to a cistern system built specifically to keep things clean. The cloister's lavatorium is a designated space for hand-washing before meals and prayers. There are basins lined in stone with clean cloths nearby. A monk walks by, carefully drying his hands after scrubbing them with, get this, soap. It's coarse, grey, made from ashes and animal fat like the usual kind, but they actually use it regularly. Why the emphasis on hygiene? Because in monastic life, cleanliness was next to godliness. The rule of St. Benedict, a kind of medieval manual for monastic living, emphasised bodily cleanliness not out of vanity, but discipline. The body was a vessel. Keeping it clean was a sign of spiritual order. So monks developed routines around washing, hands, feet, even communal bathing on certain days of the week. In some orders, weekly foot washing was a ritual of humility and brotherhood. You'd kneel, gently clean another monk's feet and dry them with care. It wasn't just hygiene, it was service. Now don't get carried away thinking this was a soap commercial. Bathing was still occasional, once a week if you were lucky, and sometimes just during major holy days. But when it happened, it was more organised and respectful than in the outside world. Some monasteries had designated bathhouses, with heated water and private stalls. You might soak in a wooden tub in silence, surrounded by candlelight and the smell of mint leaves floating in the steam. Okay, maybe that's a stretch, but by medieval standards, it was practically luxury. And then there's laundry. Yep, the monks did that too. Most monastic communities had a laundress or lay brother whose job was to wash the robes and linens, and they didn't wait until their robes could stand up on their own. Monks had multiple changes of simple clothing, tunics, scapulars, and habits made of wool or linen. These were washed, aired out, and mended regularly. Monks were often cleaner than nobles, if only because their lives were rigidly structured and surprisingly practical. Here's a fun fringe detail. Many monasteries had latrines with running water, real plumbing of a sort. Waste from toilets would be carried away through stone channels, often into nearby rivers or fields. The monks of Cluny Abbey in France had one of the most sophisticated sanitation systems of the era. Think of it as medieval indoor plumbing, built by guys in robes who spent their free time copying manuscripts and debating theology. There's a scholarly debate, of course, about how universal this cleanliness was. Some argue that monasteries were consistently ahead of the curve in hygiene. Others point out that standards varied wildly depending on the order, the wealth of the monastery, and the location. A remote hilltop hermitage wasn't going to have the same plumbing as an urban abbey with royal sponsorship. But generally speaking, monks took cleanliness more seriously than the average medieval citizen. The motivation wasn't just health. Monastic life was all about order. Cleanliness was a reflection of that order, a way to maintain discipline and spiritual focus. If your body was in chaos, how could your mind be at peace? Monks weren't aiming for physical beauty. They were aiming for inner calm. But it turns out washing your face and trimming your nails helps with that. And let's not forget the nuns. Medieval convents often had the same, if not better, hygiene practices than male monasteries. Nuns grew herbs for soaps and salves, cared for the sick, and practiced regular washing rituals. They weren't spending their days swooning in towers. They were scrubbing, rinsing, and praying in equal measure. You watch as a monk carefully trims the wick of a candle near the lavatorium. He notices you staring at the wash basin like it's a holy relic. He smiles and nods as if to say, yes, this is normal here. And for the first time in weeks, you feel like you're not being silently hunted by a swarm of parasites. You could live here, you think. Quiet mornings, clean robes, no chamber pots flying overhead, but don't get too comfortable. Monastic life was strict, repetitive, and not without its own share of grimness. Silence was enforced, food was simple, comfort was limited, and while you might stay physically cleaner, you'd better get used to praying 6 times a day and never seeing your family again. Hygiene came at a price. Still, as you leave the monastery, you feel lighter, fresher, like the dirt of the outside world hasn't quite settled back on your skin yet. You've glimpsed the possibility of cleanliness in a time of grime, and though the monks may not have had the science we do today, they understood something crucial. Order, ritual, and the occasional bath can go a long way toward keeping the chaos of the world at bay. Next, we'll leave the cloister behind and go knocking on the apothecary's door to see what passed for medical hygiene in a world where your barber was also your surgeon. Spoiler, it involves leeches, pus, and a healthy dose of terror. Say goodbye to the quiet calm of the monastery, because we're heading into much messier territory, literally. Tonight, you're off to see a medieval doctor. Or is it a barber? Maybe an apothecary? Could be all three rolled into one. That's the fun part about healthcare in the Middle Ages. Everyone's job description was suspiciously flexible, and most procedures involved blood, heat, screaming, or all three. So if you're feeling a little under the weather, maybe a touch of fever or a strange growth on your leg, brace yourself. The medieval version of medical hygiene is about to make modern hand sanitizer look like a miracle from the heavens. Let's start with the basics. You walk into a physician's chamber. It smells of musty herbs, candle wax, and faintly of something that may have been alive yesterday and isn't now. The doctor, who may or may not have any formal training, greets you in a long robe, covered in what he claims is scholarly dust from his books, but might actually be patient residue. He doesn't wash his hands because no one does. Germs, not a known concept. Cleanliness isn't even in the top 10 of his concerns. He's more worried about your humours. Ah yes, the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. According to medieval medical theory, your body is a bubbling stew of these fluids, and illness happens when they're out of balance. You're coughing? Clearly too much phlegm. Melancholy? Probably an excess of black bile. This logic forms the entire basis of diagnosis and treatment for the next several centuries, so buckle in. The physician studies your face, sniffs your breath, maybe even tastes your urine. Yes, tastes, and announces you need to be bled. And this isn't metaphorical. He grabs a lancet, possibly the same one he used yesterday, and slices into a vein in your forearm, letting your blood flow into a ceramic bowl. No gloves, no sterilization, just raw exposure to whatever mystery is clinging to that blade. You're meant to bleed until you feel lightheaded, because that means the bad humours are leaving your body. In reality, you're just on the verge of passing out. But that's medicine, baby. If your illness seems more serious, or if you're wealthy enough to be worth extra effort, he might apply leeches. These aren't metaphorical either. Real, squirming, slippery leeches applied directly to your skin to suck out the corrupt blood. They're stored in little jars or sometimes just a basin under the bench. No one sanitizes them. They're reused. You try not to vomit while one of them twitches on your ankle. Now let's say the problem is skin deep. Maybe a boil, an abscess, or something vaguely oozing. The doctor might lance it, again with that same knife, and then pack it with a poultice of herbs. Bread soaked in wine or animal dung. Yes, dung. Some believed it had healing properties, especially when mixed with honey or fat. Spoiler, it didn't. But it gave the wound a nice earthy bouquet, and probably introduced several new infections. Meanwhile, barbers were handling everything from haircuts to tooth extractions to amputations. They were your go-to guys for bloodletting, blistering, and any other minor or major procedures. You sit in a chair, they roll up your sleeve, and moments later you're watching a surprising amount of your insides become your outsides. If you're lucky, the wound gets wrapped in a relatively clean cloth. If you're really lucky, you don't get gangrene. And here's a fun fringe fact. The famous red and white barber pole? That's a direct reference to blood and bandages. The white represents the clean bandages, the red is for the blood-soaked ones, and the pole itself, that's because patients used to grip a wooden staff during procedures to keep their veins prominent. Yes, it's basically a historical symbol for open wound here. Now let's talk about apothecaries, the medieval version of pharmacists. These were your potion masters, your herbal experts, your dealers in strange powders and even stranger beliefs. You walk into a cluttered little shop, shelves lined with jars labelled in Latin. There's dried fox lung, powdered horn, crushed pearls, and all manner of roots and barks. Need something for a cough? He hands you a syrup made from violets, honey, and a touch of opium. Upset stomach. Try a tincture of wormwood and wine. Is any of this clean? Not exactly. Ingredients are often stored in open containers, stirred with reused spoons and measured by eyeball. but it smells medicinal, so that's something. There's a scholarly debate about how effective these remedies were. Some historians argue that medieval medicine, though flawed by modern standards, had its successes, especially in monastic infirmaries where herbal knowledge was more refined. Others point out that much of it was guesswork, superstition, and trial and error with very little understanding of infection or hygiene. Infections were rampant, surgery was a last resort, an open wound was an invitation to death. And sanitation in hospitals, if you can call them that. Early hospitals were more like hospices, places to die with dignity rather than places to be healed. Beds were packed together, linens were rarely changed, and the same tools were used from patient to patient. A hospital might be housed in a former church or monastery, with more prayers than procedures, and if you did need an operation, no anaesthesia, just a cloth to bite down on, and a priest whispering in your ear. Some orders, like the Knights Hospitaller, maintained more disciplined, cleaner facilities. But for the most part, medieval healthcare was messy, bloody, and wildly inconsistent. You could survive smallpox and then die of a blister. You could go in with a headache and leave without a limb. You leave the apothecary's shop clutching a small bottle of something labelled in barely readable script. It smells like vinegar and pine resin. Maybe it'll help, maybe it'll kill you. Either way, your doctor's hands never touched water. The scissors still have someone else's blood on them, and the floor is a mosaic of old fluids. You feel not better, but definitely more aware of your mortality. So as you stumble back into the street, a little paler than before, you start to think that maybe those monks had the right idea. Wash your hands, trim your nails, eat some herbs, and pray a lot. Because in the world of medieval medicine, the greatest miracle might have been survival. Next, we're heading back outside, where the pigs roam, the chickens strut, and the town square doubles as a petting zoo with a sanitation crisis. Time to explore the symbiotic, smelly relationship between medieval townsfolk and their livestock roommates. Just watch where you step. You've just left the apothecary, leaking from at least one place, your pouch lighter, your dignity slightly wounded. You'd like to limp home in peace, but unfortunately, you're sharing the road with a small herd of goats, 3 chickens, 1 suspiciously feral-looking pig, and a cow with judgmental eyes. Welcome to the medieval town square, a place where livestock weren't just background scenery, they were your co-workers, roommates, and in some ways, public health hazards with hooves. Let's start with pigs. You know, the ones rooting around in the gutters, occasionally knocking over a cart and very possibly tripping someone important. They're not strays, they belong to people. In many medieval towns, families kept pigs as walking garbage disposals. They ate kitchen scraps, spoiled vegetables, and yes, sometimes even human waste. Anything that fell on the ground belonged to the pigs, and the pigs were very, very efficient. That's great for your composting strategy, not so great for your shoe cleanliness. And they didn't stay in pens. Urban pigs were known for their freedom of movement. They'd trot right through open markets, squeeze under tables, and occasionally root around the edges of a church. Some cities tried to ban them from streets. Paris passed a law in the 14th century forbidding pigs from roaming free, but enforcement was spotty. And honestly, who was going to argue with a pig the size of a barrel? Then there were chickens. Constant, flapping, noisy chickens. Every household seemed to own at least 2, usually more. They provided eggs, and if they stopped doing that, they became dinner. But while they were alive, they had free rein of the streets, pecking at fallen grains, chasing bugs, and naturally leaving behind little gifts wherever they went. No one was scooping it up. You just hoped it would dry out fast and blend into the dust. Cows were less common inside towns, but not rare. Wealthier families might own one and keep it tethered behind the house, which was, let's be clear, not far from your front door. You could be gossiping with your neighbour and suddenly hear a low moo right behind the wall. Cows meant milk, which meant cheese and butter, which meant the occasional bonus income at the market. But they also meant large, wet piles of cow pie, which everyone tried very hard not to step in, or fall in, or accidentally track into the church. Goats were also part of the equation, scrappy, noisy, and entirely too clever. They could escape pens, jump fences, and occasionally climb places they had absolutely no business being, like rooftops. They provided milk too, and occasionally meat, but mostly they existed to chew on things you didn't want them to chew on, like laundry, parchment, and small children's hair. And of course, let's not forget the dogs. Not pets, really. More like scavengers that lived among humans. They fought each other in the streets. barked at pigs and followed fishmongers around like furry shadows. Some were technically owned, but few were trained. They ate whatever they could find: bones, scraps, things best left undescribed. Occasionally they got into fights that left someone bleeding, and on rare but memorable occasions they went full feral and had to be put down, usually with a stick or a brick. Cats were less common in town centres, more associated with barns and granaries, where they earned their keep by murdering rats. They weren't universally loved. In fact, during certain centuries, cats, especially black ones, were associated with witchcraft and driven out or killed, ironically allowing the rat population to spike, which, in turn, helped diseases spread faster. So yes, your ancestors' war on cats may have accidentally helped the Black Death. Oops. Now, here's a weird little fringe fact that says everything about how medieval people saw animals. Some towns put animals on trial, like actual trials. If a pig killed a child, it could be arrested, put on trial and executed. There are court records from the 14th and 15th centuries showing pigs being hanged for murder. Sometimes they were even dressed in tiny pig-sized outfits for the courtroom. You're laughing now, but this was dead serious. The line between human and animal law was blurry when you shared the same space, the same diet, and, let's be honest, the same hygiene standards. But back to the streets. With animals everywhere, you might be wondering how anyone managed to walk through town without stepping in something revolting. The answer? They didn't. The streets were a constant obstacle course. You learned to step lightly, watch for piles, and always keep a corner of your tunic free to wipe your shoes. And during market days, it got worse. The town square turned into a blur of hooves, claws, wings, and people trying to sell bread while dodging droppings. Some towns tried to regulate it. There were street sweepers, real jobs, who cleared the worst of the filth. Some cities imposed fines on owners who let animals run wild, but again, enforcement was inconsistent. A wealthy merchant could bribe an official to ignore his goat problem. A poor woman with a prize pig might take her chances. And honestly, most people just accepted it. If you lived in a medieval town, you learned to live with the animals. They were part of the rhythm of life. Annoying, useful, stinky roommates who never paid rent and always peed on the floor. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about just how integrated animals were into medieval urban planning. Some argue that the cities were built for mixed use, humans and animals side by side, because that's how the economy worked. Others say animals were tolerated but not welcomed, and that increasing urbanization in later centuries pushed them out. Either way, for most of the medieval period, livestock were part of the scenery, and not the background part. The up-close, loud, smelly, possibly biting foreground. So, as you make your way home, you dodge a goat climbing onto a cart, step over a particularly fresh cow pile, and wave to a boy chasing a runaway chicken down the alley. It's noisy, chaotic, and smells faintly of cheese gone wrong. But it's normal. You live in a town that breathes, eats, and yes, poops with its animals. Next time we'll turn our attention to the bathhouse, a place of social gathering, bodily exposure, and increasingly sketchy reputation. Communal tubs, gossip, and a decline into something the church really didn't want you enjoying. Towel optional. You've braved the streets full of pigs, the goat ambushes, the surprisingly violent chickens, and somehow managed to keep your ankles intact. But now you're about to step into a place that promises warmth, water, and, dare we say it, relaxation. Welcome to the medieval public bathhouse, a steamy oasis of shared tubs, slippery floors, and conversation that ranges from political gossip to very personal rashes. On the surface, bathhouses seem like a miracle, a rare chance to get warm, clean, and social all in one visit. But don't get too comfortable, because what starts as a scrub could very well turn into scandal. You duck under a wooden sign etched with a worn-looking towel and step inside. The air is heavy with steam, and the mingled scent of rosemary, old soap, wet skin, and damp wood. You can barely see across the room. The bathhouse is loud, men shouting to each other across the pools, women laughing behind wooden partitions, and the rhythmic splash of water hitting stone. At first glance it feels like a spa day. At second glance, well, things get complicated. Bathhouses were a big deal in medieval towns, especially in places like Germany, the Low Countries, and parts of France and Italy. They started out innocently enough, a public health effort, a place where people could bathe regularly, especially if they didn't have the means at home. Some towns even had laws encouraging regular visits. Certain guilds scheduled mandatory bathhouse days for apprentices. Cleanliness was briefly trending. Inside, you find a large heated pool surrounded by benches and smaller tubs for rinsing. Attendants, known as stewards or bathers, move between patrons with buckets of hot water. Soap is available, usually the scratchy, lye-based kind, but there are also bowls of ash and sand for exfoliation. People shave, scrub, and soak. They're not shy about it either. Bathhouses were usually communal and co-ed. Yes, men and women in the same space, often bathing together. Modesty existed, but not in the way you're used to. You glance around and realise most people are at least partially clothed. Linen bathing shifts or loose wraps are common. But they don't do much, and not everyone bothers. In some bathhouses, full nudity is just part of the atmosphere, and that's where things get steamy, both literally and metaphorically. As bathhouses grew more popular, their reputation began to change. The line between a place to wash and a place to entertain blurred. Private rooms were added, partitions went up, attendants offered more than just hot water. Soon, bathhouses were doubling as brothels, or at least as convenient meeting spots for less than chaste rendezvous. You come in for a rinse and leave with a venereal souvenir, or possibly a scandal. The church naturally hated this. At first, they tolerated bathhouses because cleanliness was tied to morality. But by the late medieval period, bathhouses were seen as dens of sin. Preachers condemned them from the pulpit. Bishops issued bans. In some cities, the church tried to close them altogether, citing sexual immorality, disease, and the mixing of the sexes. The irony? The more forbidden they became, the more popular they got. Because nothing sells quite like disapproval. Now here's a strange but true fringe fact. Some bathhouses had menus, literal menus, listing not just services and prices, but also who was available to assist you, some with skill ratings. You could choose your bath temperature, your soap, your massage, and possibly your company for the evening. These places blurred the line between wellness centre and very damp nightclub. Of course, not all bathhouses were scandalous. Many genuinely tried to keep things clean and respectful. Some towns had gender-segregated bathing days, or even separate facilities altogether. Others posted rules. No roughhousing, no indecent exposure, no loose behaviour. But rules are only as good as their enforcement, and when a place smells of herbs and sweat and everyone's already mostly naked, well, temptation had a very strong recruiting strategy. There's a scholarly debate about whether bathhouses were actually dangerous, or just a convenient target for moral outrage. On one hand, yes, the spread of disease, particularly STIs, was a risk. But then again, avoiding bathhouses didn't stop people from catching things elsewhere. Some historians argue that shutting them down probably made public hygiene worse. Others believe that the moral panic was exaggerated, fueled by misogyny and the church's obsession with controlling bodies. What's clear is that bathhouses were complicated, a mix of social hub, wellness centre, dating app, and public health experiment. And they weren't just for the rich. Everyone used them. Peasants, merchants, nobles, clergy, sometimes secretly. Even the occasional visiting dignitary. You'd find someone discussing politics in one corner, a baker getting his back scrubbed in another, and two teenagers whispering in the steam behind a partition. It was equal parts bath and theatre. You went to get clean, sure, but you also went to see and be seen. Then came the plague. The Black Death, always the party pooper, changed everything. Fear of contagion caused many bathhouses to close. The idea of sharing water with strangers suddenly felt more like a death sentence than a luxury. Some reopened later, often with stricter rules. Others were repurposed or abandoned. And while the bathhouse never completely disappeared, its golden age was definitely over by the 16th century. In its place came the idea of private washing, and eventually, centuries later, the modern bathroom. But tonight you soak in the tub surrounded by voices and steam. A woman across the room scrubs her arms while chatting with a merchant about the price of rye. A man nearby sings softly, off-key but cheerful. You close your eyes and let the warmth seep into your bones. It smells faintly of thyme, sweat, and whatever questionable decision the couple behind you is making. But for now, you're relaxed, cleanish. Suspicious of your neighbour, sure, but content. Tomorrow, the scandal will return, The preachers will rant. The stewards will mop up whatever happens behind that curtain. But for tonight, this bathhouse is still clinging to its original promise: warmth, water, and a temporary escape from the grimy grind of medieval life. Next, we'll turn our eyes to the heavens, or rather to the church, and explore how religious beliefs shaped, encouraged, and occasionally sabotaged medieval hygiene. Because when saints meet soap, things get weird fast. Tonight we're climbing out of the bathhouse steam and straight into the steeple. After all, if you want to understand medieval hygiene, or its frequent enthusiastic absence, you've got to talk about the one institution that touched every aspect of daily life, from cradle to grave, dirt to divinity: the church. In a time before science had solid footing and before public health was anything more than a communal shrug, religion filled the gaps. And when it came to staying clean, or deliberately not, the church had opinions. So grab your rosary, maybe a sprig of rosemary for the smell, and let's figure out why your priest might have told you to wash your soul but not your feet. First, let's be fair. The early church didn't outright hate cleanliness. In fact, some early Christian texts praised bathing, especially in the context of ritual purity. Monks and nuns, as we've seen, often kept their environments cleaner than the outside world. Washing hands before meals, feet before prayers, these were regular, almost sacred acts. Cleanliness could represent discipline, humility, and readiness for worship. That said, once we moved into the heart of the Middle Ages, especially post-plague, the tone shifted. The focus turned sharply inward. The soul, the church declared, was what mattered, not the body. You wake up in your village on a Sunday morning. You're itchy, your breath smells like garlic and regret, and your clothes could probably stand up on their own. But you're going to church, so you change into your Lice-stained tunic and do a quick splash of water on your face. Not because you're trying to look good, vanity's a sin, but because you want to show respect. Physical cleanliness was acceptable when it demonstrated spiritual preparation. Beyond that, well, if you were too focused on looking polished, someone might suspect you were consorting with the devil. Or worse, French. This tension between body and soul played out in strange ways. On one hand, the church endorsed washing before sacraments, encouraged pilgrimages to holy springs believed to heal the body and the spirit, and even maintained public bathhouses in some early Christian communities. On the other hand, they preached against excess bathing, scented oils, and anything that smacked of indulgence. Baths were dangerously close to luxury, and luxury led to sin, which led to, well, eternal damnation. This gave rise to the idea that dirty was holy. Not metaphorically, literally. Saints and ascetics were often praised for refusing to wash. Martyrs who went years without bathing were seen as devout warriors against vanity. Stories circulated of saints who never removed their clothes, who lived in caves, or who grew thick crusts of filth as a sign of their purity. Dirt was their armour, their funk was their faith. Take Saint Benedict Joseph Labre. Not only did he refuse to bathe or wash his clothes, but he also intentionally slept in gutters and refused shelter. People reportedly gagged when he entered a room, but also claimed he glowed with divine light. He stank for Jesus, and everyone respected it, or feared it. It's a fine line. Here's a slightly disturbing fringe fact. Some religious thinkers claim that washing too often might actually invite sin by making you more physically appealing. In other words, if you were too clean, you might tempt others. So really, if you loved your neighbour, you'd stay a little crusty. It was an act of mercy. This moral suspicion toward cleanliness wasn't just personal, it was institutional. The church began regulating bathhouses, condemning their association with sin and sensuality. They tried to close them down during Lent. They frowned on co-ed bathing, and in sermons they warned that washing the body might distract from washing the soul. After all, what's a clean body worth if your heart is filthy with pride? Yet at the same time, the church knew dirt could be a problem. Monasteries kept basic hygiene rules. Pilgrimages were often made to holy wells, or miracle springs, where people believed that washing could heal not just the body but the soul. Some priests even blessed water for its purifying properties. Water, after all, was central to baptism, the ultimate spiritual cleansing. So clearly cleanliness wasn't the problem. Why you were doing it was. Scholars still debate how much the church actually influenced day-to-day hygiene habits. Some argue that church teachings deeply affected how people saw cleanliness, encouraging asceticism and suspicion toward bodily care. Others suggest that most peasants didn't need religious permission to stay dirty. They were already too poor and busy to worry about soap. The sermons may have reinforced what was already happening rather than creating it. After all, if your only set of clothes hasn't been washed in weeks, it's comforting to hear that God doesn't mind. And yet, there were exceptions. During outbreaks of disease, some clergy advocated for more frequent hand-washing, burning of herbs, and even quarantine, a practice that began in monastic infirmaries long before secular authorities caught on. Hospitals run by religious orders were often cleaner than their non-religious counterparts. There were even saints associated with healing and cleanliness, like Saint Roch, who was said to have miraculously survived the plague, and was often depicted with a sore on his leg and a loyal dog licking it. Odd, but hey, it sold a lot of candles. Still, you couldn't escape the overall vibe. Too much concern with your body was dangerous. It was the shell, not the soul. Let it rot. Let it smell. Salvation was a spiritual matter, and if you stank your way into heaven, all the better. As you leave church, the sun's already high. You pass a beggar who hasn't bathed in months and is clutching a wooden cross. A few children play near the fountain, splashing each other with water from a barrel that's probably not safe to drink. The priest, freshly done with his sermon about humility, sneezes into his sleeve and wipes it on his cassock. It's all very medieval. The sacred and the filthy coexisting without complaint. And now we turn toward the stranger corners of this religious relationship with hygiene, where holy dirt was believed to cure disease, miracle water healed the blind, and pilgrims dragged themselves through muck to prove their faith. It's time to get spiritual and sticky. By now, you've come to accept that medieval hygiene wasn't just about dirt and soap. It was about belief. Faith seeped into everything. Food, medicine, and yes, even filth. And now we've arrived at one of the strangest, most pungent intersections of all. The mystical zone where people believed that holy grime could heal, mud could purify, and water, if touched by the right saint or miracle, could reverse death itself. Welcome to the realm of miracle baths, sacred sludge, and divine bodily fluids. If you weren't itchy before, you probably will be now. You've heard of pilgrims dragging themselves across Europe to reach relics and shrines. What you might not know is that many of these sacred destinations were wet, muddy, or just outright sticky. Healing springs dotted the landscape, often located near sites of alleged miracles. The water there was believed to hold divine power, not because it was clean, but because it had touched something, or someone, holy. Saint bathed here? That spring now cures leprosy. Virgin Mary appeared nearby. This puddle now fixes blindness. And if you thought boiling the water was necessary, guess again. Holiness was expected to take care of germs, so you arrive at one of these holy wells. Maybe it's St Winifred's Well in Wales, or a lesser-known spring bubbling out from under a mossy chapel. Pilgrims are gathered around, dipping cups, filling jars, splashing it on their faces. Some submerge entirely, others just rub the water on afflicted limbs. You watch as a man with a limp climbs into the chilli basin and prays while shivering violently. Whether he's healed or not is questionable, but faith isn't really about outcomes, it's about the effort. Nearby, a woman is scooping up mud from the banks and carefully rubbing it on her swollen knee. You ask why. She tells you this earth is blessed, since someone or other once lay in this dirt and now it's holy. You nod respectfully and try not to think about the rats you saw earlier. The mud smells like peat and hope, and that's enough. In some cases, the miracle wasn't even in the water. It was in the relic soaking in the water. Pieces of saints' bones, scraps of clothing, even vials of holy blood were sometimes immersed in baths to sanctify them. Pilgrims believed that just touching or bathing in these waters could cure disease, infertility, madness, and a host of other afflictions that modern science would label needs antibiotics immediately. But in a world where medicine meant leeches and guesswork, miracle water was a pretty attractive option. Here's where it gets weirder. In some shrines, the dirt itself was considered a sacred substance. People scooped it up and took it home, not just as a souvenir, but to eat. Yes, ingest. Holy dirt was mixed with bread, sprinkled into porridge, and sometimes baked into little talismans. It was supposed to protect you, strengthen your spirit, and occasionally clear up a suspicious rash. Probably didn't help the plumbing, but that's beside the point, and if you were really devout, or really desperate, You might not even care whether the dirt was technically holy. There are stories of pilgrims crawling through the mud around a holy site, believing that the act of suffering itself was redemptive. If you emerged caked in filth, bruised, sore and sobbing, you were closer to God. Mud became a kind of spiritual armour, and in a society where pain equalled piety, wading through sludge was just another way to prove your worth. Let's not forget about sweat relics either. These were cloths believed to carry the sweat or bodily fluids of saints. Kept in reliquaries, or used to anoint the sick, they were considered potent spiritual medicine. Never mind that the cloth was centuries old and had probably passed through 40 sweaty bishops and a few moth infestations. If it touched a holy person, it had power. You rubbed it on your forehead and hoped the boils would go away. Now here's a fringe fact that's so medieval it almost loops around to modern wellness nonsense. Some pilgrims believed that the act of not washing after a holy encounter preserved the divine residue, meaning if you bathed in a sacred spring, you were supposed to let it dry naturally, never wipe it off, and ideally never bathe again. You wanted the holiness to soak in. So yes, someone might have travelled 300 miles for one bath, and then chosen to remain unwashed for months in order to preserve the effect. Sainthood, now available in damp crust. Of course, there's debate about how widespread these practices really were. Some historians argue that holy filth was mostly a fringe belief, limited to especially zealous pilgrims or certain rural regions. Others point to the volume of miracle stories involving mud, water, or relics, and suggest it was a central part of medieval spirituality. Either way, enough people bought into it that shrines across Europe remained in business for centuries, drawing thousands of travellers eager to dunk themselves in whatever liquid was rumoured to fix their problems. And while it's easy to scoff from the safety of the 21st century, think about what they were working with. When doctors bled you with unwashed blades and barbers prescribed dung poultices, a muddy puddle blessed by St. Jerome didn't seem like such a wild option. At least you didn't need a prescription or a copay. Just a little faith, a long walk, and a high tolerance for earthy textures. So here you are, drying in the sun, your clothes stiff with miracle mud, your skin tingling from either holiness or mild infection. Either way, you feel hopeful. You've done the thing. You've touched the water. You've eaten the dirt. You're part of the tradition now. And even if you're not healed, you feel lighter. Whether that's divine intervention or dehydration is up for debate. Next up, we'll take a sharper turn into the more judgmental side of medieval hygiene. The belief that washing too often was suspicious, vain, or even sinful. Because nothing says God is watching like someone scolding you for your clean fingernails. So you've scrubbed in sacred springs, patted miracle mud onto your swollen ankles, and maybe even tasted a bit of sanctified dirt. Congratulations, your soul's sparkling even if your body still smells like a sheepfold. But now comes the twist. You finally feel a little clean, and suddenly people are looking at you weird. Because in some parts of the Middle Ages, washing too much didn't just make you stand out, it made you suspicious. Maybe even sinful. That's right. Welcome to the era where being clean could land you in hot theological water, which, ironically, you were supposed to avoid. It starts small. You've washed your hair, someone notices. You trying to impress someone, they ask, half joking, half judging. Another whispers, bit vain, don't you think? And suddenly, the room's temperature drops a few degrees. Because personal cleanliness, in certain religious circles, came dangerously close to pride. One of the 7 deadly sins. And nothing in medieval society was scarier than being too proud, especially about your body. Vanity wasn't just about fancy clothes or showing off. It extended to how much attention you gave to grooming. Trimmed nails, pride, glossy hair, pride, shiny skin, pride and possible witchcraft, depending on how you achieved that glow. People who bathed regularly, or worse, scented themselves, were often assumed to be too focused on worldly pleasures. They weren't just trying to look nice. They were distracting others, tempting the opposite sex, or placing the needs of the flesh above the needs of the soul. Of course, there's some nuance here. Washing before church? Good. Washing before a feast to honour a saint? Fine. Washing twice a week and smelling faintly of lavender on a random Tuesday? Risky. That was just asking for gossip. And in close-knit communities where everyone noticed everything, it didn't take much to earn a reputation. She's always clean, someone might whisper, but never at Mass. You didn't want to be that person. This wasn't just a rural superstition thing. Even in cities, certain classes frowned on excessive hygiene. For labourers, who toiled in dirt and sweat, someone with spotless clothes was either rich or idle, and idleness was another sin. In the medieval moral hierarchy, being busy and grubby was better than being clean and doing nothing. Even merchants, who were usually more concerned with appearance, didn't want to look too polished. That might make you seem soft, or French, or worse, courtly. Now here's a fascinating fringe belief. In some areas, it was thought that washing regularly made you physically weaker. Yes, weaker. The logic? Bathing opened your pores, which let in disease, yes, but also weakened your humours. A peasant who bathed too often might fall ill, or lose their appetite, or become emotionally fragile. Bathing could literally wash away your strength. That sounds ridiculous today, but remember, medical advice back then also included things like tie a dead mole around your neck to cure a sore throat. So, relatively speaking, it was one of the less insane ideas. And then, there's the whole issue of class. If you were clean all the time, people might mistake you for nobility, or worse, assume you were pretending to be nobility. In a world with strict social hierarchies, where everyone knew their place, this was dangerous. Sumptuary laws dictated what you could wear based on your class, but hygiene, that was a grey area. Smelling like rosewater when you were supposed to smell like cow, that wasn't ambition, that was subversion. The church, as usual, had thoughts. While monasteries promoted hygiene as a form of spiritual discipline, other religious authorities warned against it as an indulgence. Preachers condemned women who spent too much time grooming. They warned that scented oils led to fornication, that clean skin tempted demons, and that idle hands, especially clean ones, were the devil's playground. In sermons, cleanliness was often bundled with other soft sins: laziness, luxury, lust, all that good, clean fun. There's a scholar-fueled debate about how widespread this anti-hygiene mindset really was. Some argue it's overstated, that most people didn't associate washing with sin, they just didn't have the resources to do it. Others point to the volume of religious texts and social records that link cleanliness with suspicion, and say, yeah, if you smelled too good in 1340, someone probably thought you were possessed. The truth likely sits somewhere in the middle. Attitudes varied wildly depending on geography, class and religious climate. In other words, in one village you might be praised for your rosy cheeks, in another, burned for witchcraft because of your suspiciously smooth elbows. And let's not forget the gendered double standard. Women were often expected to maintain a certain level of appearance, enough to seem modest and clean, but not so much that they appeared seductive. That was a tightrope walk through a field of judgmental monks. Men, meanwhile, could look as filthy as a barn wall and still be considered pious. A muddy tunic on a man was a sign of labour and humility. On a woman, it could mean she was lazy, or worse, unruly. But if she tried to clean up, vain. You literally couldn't win. So you, being reasonably self-aware, start adjusting your routine. Maybe don't wash your hair too often. Don't wear herbs on your sleeves unless there's a holy day. And if someone compliments your clean hands, you quickly mention that it's only because you were kneading dough for the poor. And then you whisper something about penance, just in case. Still, people found ways to stay at least moderately clean without attracting attention. They rinsed their faces in private. They wore linen shifts under their clothes to absorb sweat, swapping those out without needing to wash their outer garments. They scented their bed sheets or burned herbs indoors. Hygiene didn't disappear, it just went stealth mode. After all, even in an age of suspicion, no one likes lice. You walk through the market square noticing who's just clean enough to seem respectable, and who's looking a little too radiant for a Tuesday. Everyone is managing appearances, walking that line between pious and suspicious. The baker smells faintly of flour and bay leaves. Harmless. The weaver's daughter is glowing, and everyone's staring. Meanwhile, you're wondering if it's too early in the season to scrub your cloak, or if someone will take it as a sign you've gotten above yourself. And so, we come to the twisted medieval conclusion. Be clean enough to not die, but not so clean that people think you're enjoying it. Because in a world where morality, vanity and filth were locked in an eternal three-way fight, the greatest virtue might just have been looking slightly better than your neighbour, but never too much. Coming up next, we're going back to basics, literally to look at what medieval toilets were like across castles, cottages, and the increasingly tragic attempts to make them more private. Spoiler, there's a lot of wood, a lot of holes, and very little dignity. You've endured the bathhouse scandal, dabbled in sacred dirt, and survived the great soap-shaming of the overly clean. But tonight, we're dropping all pretenses and heading into one of the most unavoidable and deeply humbling parts of medieval hygiene, the toilet. Yes, it's time. You've got to go. And in the Middle Ages, that meant aiming your business over a hole in the floor and praying to every saint you knew that the wind was blowing in the right direction. So where did people actually go to relieve themselves? That depends on who you were and how high up, literally and socially, you happen to be. Let's start at the top. You're in a castle, perched high above the landscape, and somewhere between the battlements and the buttery is a narrow, drafty little room called the garderobe. Don't let the fancy name fool you. It's not glamorous. This was the castle toilet, a tiny chamber built into the outer wall with a stone or wooden seat and a vertical shaft that dropped your offerings directly into the moat or pit below. Sometimes a stone slab featured a keyhole opening. Sometimes just a long wooden bench with more than one hole, because apparently privacy was overrated. The air inside, best described as perpetual wind tunnel with notes of despair. There's a reason these rooms were built into exterior walls, ventilation. But even with a breeze, it was not a pleasant place. Cold in the winter, steamy in the summer, and always echoing with the gentle sound of waste meeting the side of a wall 40 feet below. Occasionally, unfortunate engineering meant waste pooled in corners or splashed back. You quickly learned to sit with caution. Now here's the fun part. People sometimes stored their clothes in the garderobe. Yes, stored. The ammonia-rich environment was believed to repel moths and lice, so hanging your cloak in the poop room was, oddly enough, part of your laundry strategy. This is the kind of historical detail that's both horrifying and brilliant. You smelled like medieval Febreze, dung-scented but moth-free. If you weren't royalty, or lucky enough to be living in a stone fortress, your situation got more basic. Most peasants used pits dug in the backyard or communal privies shared by several families. These were simple affairs. A wooden bench with a hole, balanced precariously over a pit that was dug, used, filled, and then, ideally, covered over and moved. No flushing, no separation of solids and liquids, and absolutely no dignity if the wind shifted. Many of these pits were just feet away from where people cooked, cleaned and slept. Sometimes there was a curtain, sometimes not. Children were expected to use them from a young age, and if you were working the fields or travelling, nature was your bathroom, a hedge, a tree, the side of a road. Anywhere you could squat discreetly and hope you weren't sitting in yesterday's leftovers. Public areas in towns had cesspits, often built beneath or beside buildings. These collected the waste from homes via wooden or ceramic pipes. Think of them as medieval plumbing minus the hygiene. These cesspits needed regular emptying, a task handled by some of the unluckiest people in history. Gong farmers. They worked at night, armed with shovels, buckets, and absolutely no sense of smell left. They were paid relatively well, probably because no one else wanted the job, and were sometimes legally required to live apart from others, which feels both cruel and completely understandable. Let's pause for a fringe fact that will make you question every antique you've ever admired. Some medieval people reused toilet brushes. These were bundles of rags or moss on a stick, dipped in water and, yes, shared. Public latrines often had a communal sponge or cloth on a stick sitting in a bucket of vinegar or salt water. Effective? Maybe. Sanitary? Not even remotely. You might be wondering, what about toilet paper? Short answer, nope. Long answer, people used whatever was available. Straw, moss, hay, leaves, wool scraps if you were fancy. Smooth river stones were a favourite in some regions, and in really desperate times, your own hand. Washed afterward, of course, with luck, if there was a bucket nearby. There's a bit of academic disagreement on just how filthy medieval toilets really were. Some archaeologists point to surprisingly advanced waste management in certain cities, with multi-chambered cesspits and early attempts at sewer systems. Others emphasise the sheer volume of human waste left to fester in alleys, behind houses, and even on stairwells. The reality likely varied wildly depending on location, wealth, and the season. One thing's for sure, none of it smelled good. Speaking of cities, let's not forget the urban outhouse nightmare. In crowded towns, many buildings shared latrines that drained into open trenches or the river. Waste might travel through rudimentary wooden channels, meaning if you lived downhill, well, you got more than just runoff during a rainstorm. The Thames in London, for example, was notorious for carrying more than water, and while people tried to use night soil collectors to haul it away, enforcement was loose, and dumping waste into the street was depressingly common. You're walking through one of these towns now, tiptoeing down a narrow lane, when a voice shouts from above, "Gardyloo!" That's your cue to jump. A chamber pot is being emptied from the second floor. You move just in time to avoid a splash, but your boots aren't so lucky. They squelch with every step now, and you make a mental note to burn them later. Despite all this, the need for privacy grew. By the late medieval period, some wealthier homes included enclosed privies, small wooden or stone rooms tucked away from the main quarters. They often emptied into cesspits or directly into moats, because why not turn your castle's best defence into a toilet? Some even featured early attempts at flushing systems using rainwater channeled from the roof. Innovation, thy name is desperation. Still, no matter how sophisticated the architecture, the reality of medieval toilet time remained stubbornly grim. It was cold, awkward, smelly, and almost always risky. Spiders, rats, and unfortunate splinters lurked in dark corners. Falling in wasn't just the stuff of nightmares. It actually happened. And if you had digestive issues, well, good luck finding a second hole. Most guardrobes weren't designed for group therapy. As you finish your business, carefully, quickly, trying not to make eye contact with the spider in the corner, you realise something. Medieval hygiene wasn't just about survival. It was about adapting, constantly, to a world that refused to make anything easy. Even using the toilet was an exercise in creative problem-solving and lowered expectations. And next, we're diving into something even more stomach-turning. The many charming, creative, and occasionally terrifying uses of urine in medieval hygiene. Yes, pee. They washed with it. They cleaned with it. Some even drank it. You're not ready, but we're going there anyway. All right, it's time. You've done the mud, the sweat, the monks, the moats, and now you're standing at the very edge of medieval hygiene's strangest, smelliest frontier. Welcome to the world of urine, also known in the Middle Ages as chamber lye, aqua vitae, or, let's be real, just pee. That's right. Tonight we're exploring how the very fluid you're trying to discreetly dispose of after dinner was once the centerpiece of household cleaning, medicine, laundry, and even personal grooming. This is not a drill. People were out here bathing in it, boiling it, sniffing it, and yes, gulp, sometimes even tasting it. So let's begin with laundry, because somehow this is the least upsetting use of urine. In an era before bleach detergent or literally any other effective cleaning product, people had to get creative with whatever mildly corrosive liquid was available. Enter urine. Fresh pee isn't particularly strong, but let it sit for a few days and it breaks down into ammonia, which, surprise, is an excellent natural cleanser. It cuts grease, lifts stains, and eats through grime. Medieval fullers, those were the folks who cleaned and processed wool, relied on huge vats of old urine to soak fabric, remove lanolin and whiten the cloth. They'd then stomp on it barefoot, squishing it between their toes like grapes in a wine press. Just don't think too hard about that image. And this wasn't a fringe practice. In cities like London, Edinburgh and Paris, people would actually collect urine from chamber pots and sell it to fullers. Some towns even had public urine troughs for donations. It's like a weird medieval recycling program, except instead of sorting plastics, you're lugging around buckets of stranger pee. If you had a full chamber pot in the morning, it wasn't waste, it was profit. But the usefulness of urine didn't stop at laundry. Oh no, it wormed its way into medicine too. Got acne? Rub some warm urine on it. Toothache? Rinse your mouth with a fresh morning sample. Ideally your own, because who knows where other people have been. Blisters, burns, even animal bites, urine poultice. It was believed to draw out infection, reduce inflammation, and rebalance the humours. In fact, some physicians claimed that urine had both diagnostic and healing properties. That's why they didn't just look at it, they tasted it. Yes, medieval doctors were highly trained in uroscopy, the art of examining urine to determine a patient's condition. They'd pour your sample into a clear glass bottle, called a matula, and then hold it up to the light, swirling it around like a fine wine. They observed colour, clarity, odour, and even texture. A few bold souls would dip a finger in and give it a taste. Fruity, might be diabetes. Bitter, possibly liver disease, pungent and cloudy, well, something's definitely wrong. There were even urine colour charts, literal medieval mood rings made of pee. And speaking of flavour, yes, some people took things even further. There are scattered records of drinking urine for its healing properties, especially among alchemists and fringe mystics. They believed urine carried the essence of the body's internal balance, so naturally, the solution to imbalance was to reintroduce it, kind of like kombucha, but more horrifying. Luckily, this wasn't widespread, but the fact that anyone did it is enough to ruin your next lemonade. Meanwhile, barbers and surgeons, those medieval jack-of-all-bloody trades, also used urine as a sterilising agent. Don't get too excited, they didn't understand germ theory. They just noticed that wounds rinsed with old pee didn't always get worse, and sometimes even healed faster, which, given the alternatives like dung or lard, made urine a pretty solid option. Soldiers in particular were encouraged to make water on their own injuries during battle. It was warm, accessible, and kind of free, like battlefield first aid but without any of the dignity. Here's a particularly bizarre fringe fact. In some noble households, morning urine was used as a hair rinse. Why? Because the ammonia could supposedly clean the scalp and even lighten the hair over time. Think of it as proto-bleach. It also helped control lice, which is probably the only defensible part of that strategy. So yes, you might have walked into a 14th century court and been greeted by the scent of violets, cinnamon, and gently aged wee. And lest you think this was just a peasant trick, high society was very much on board with their bodily fluids. Court doctors often prescribed urine-based remedies. Some nuns recorded holy recipes involving urine, eggshells, and herbs. A few physicians recommended using it as an eye wash for conjunctivitis. In at least one 15th century text, it suggested that kings and nobles keep a flask of their own urine for daily review, just in case any imbalance should arise. Ah yes, your personal golden elixir, always close at hand. Now, to be fair, scholars debate how often urine was really used this way. Some argue that its prevalence in texts is exaggerated, that most people didn't bathe in it regularly or keep it on tap like Gatorade. Others point to the overwhelming number of recipes, instructions, and medical manuals that mention it and say, nope, this was totally a thing. At the very least, it was culturally available. Everyone knew about it. Some embraced it. Others probably just gagged quietly and moved on. You're probably wondering if there was ever a tipping point, a moment when people said, hey, maybe we don't need to rub our face with pee anymore. The answer is, slowly, yes. As new cleaning agents were discovered and medical science advanced, urine gradually lost its shine. By the Renaissance, its use in medicine had mostly faded, though fullers still stomped happily through their pea-soaked wool until industrial detergents came along. But during the height of medieval grime, urine was a secret weapon, a gross, acrid, often warm little miracle that managed to clean your clothes, heal your wounds, and scare away moths. It was disgusting. It was brilliant. It was everywhere. And now, with your newly acquired appreciation for bodily waste, we'll turn the final page of our dirty tale and explore how the tide slowly turned. Because yes, there was a hygiene renaissance. Slowly but surely, people began to scrub more, stink less, and start taking this whole clean thing a little more seriously. You've spent the last several nights slogging through the very worst that medieval hygiene had to offer. Mud, rot, dung, bathhouse gossip, leeches, and yes, far more pee than anyone should have to consider before bed. But don't despair just yet. Tonight something shifts. A breeze of lavender drifts in. Someone lights a scented candle that's not masking the smell of a latrine. Clothes are getting cleaner, hair is getting brushed. Soap starts smelling less like rendered goat and more like something you'd actually rub on your skin voluntarily. Welcome to the gentle trickle of change, the early stirrings of hygiene reform, the long, slow bath leading into the Renaissance. You wake up in the mid-1400s, and while you still hear pigs snorting outside and children hurling turnips through the streets, something feels different. People are starting to care. Not everyone, and not everywhere, but the whispers are growing louder. Being clean might not just be for monks and weirdos anymore, it might actually be fashionable. Let's start with the soap. Up until now, we've talked about soap like it's a punishment for your skin, a rough grey paste made of ash, animal fat and quiet resentment. But now, in places like Spain, Italy and southern France, the art of real soap making is getting a glow-up. Thanks to Arab influence and Mediterranean trade, high-quality soap made with olive oil and lye, known as Castile soap, is becoming more available. It smells better, lathers more gently, and doesn't take a layer of skin with it when you use it. The wealthy start to stock it in their homes, sometimes perfumed with herbs or citrus. You see a bar wrapped in cloth and tied with a ribbon in the corner of someone's washstand, and you think, that looks nice. And it's not just soap. People are getting into personal grooming like never before. Teeth cleaning, once the domain of frayed sticks and crushed bone, becomes a daily ritual among the rich, using powders made of mint, salt, or even charcoal. Combs and brushes are found in more households. Mirrors, once rare and suspicious, become symbols of status, allowing people to inspect their own faces before being inspected by others. Cleanliness begins to intertwine with identity. How you looked was starting to reflect who you were. Of course, this shift doesn't happen in a vacuum. Several major forces are pushing medieval Europe toward the suds. 1. The rise of humanism. As the Renaissance dawns, people become more interested in the body, not just as a sack of sin and meat, but as something beautiful, worthy of celebration, study and care. Artists are painting flesh that glows. Sculptors carve muscles and soft bellies and curls of hair. If you're going to be someone's muse, you better not smell like sheep. Another huge nudge, the printing press. Now that ideas can move faster than a horse-drawn cart, hygiene advice, yes, actual printed instructions, start circulating. Pamphlets recommend daily washing, changing your linens, brushing your teeth, and even, gasp, bathing your whole body more than once a month. It's revolutionary stuff, and not just among the elite. Literacy is still limited, but as information becomes more accessible, cultural norms begin to shift from survive to maybe also smell okay while you do it. And while we're talking cultural shifts, let's give a round of applause to trade routes. With goods flowing more freely between Europe, the Middle East and Asia, hygiene products become more varied and occasionally more delightful. People begin using rosewater, saffron, and even imported spices to perfume their bodies and homes. Bathhouses, once in decline, make a cautious comeback in some regions, now with more structure, separation, and fewer questionable side quests. Wealthy homes add dedicated washing rooms, complete with basins, warm water, and someone to scrub your back who hopefully isn't also your apothecary. Let's take a moment to appreciate a deeply weird fringe development, the handkerchief renaissance. What started as a fancy cloth for wiping noses and blotting sweat quickly became a full-blown fashion accessory. Noblemen and ladies perfumed them, embroidered initials on them, and sometimes waved them flirtatiously in the direction of a crush. More importantly, the presence of a clean, sweet-smelling cloth on your person was a subtle signal. I care about hygiene, and I also might be irresistible. Of course, not everyone was on board. Plenty of towns still reeked, and rural folk weren't exactly trading in their dung-scrubbed tunics for rose-scented tunics. But even among the poor, little changes crept in. More people started washing their faces regularly. Communal fountains were used more frequently. Linen underclothes became more standard, helping absorb sweat and dirt, which, let's be honest, was better than nothing. And slowly, very slowly, cities began thinking about sanitation in a real coordinated way. This brings us to the emergence of urban hygiene planning, a phrase that would have made a 12th century pig herder laugh until he coughed up his own lung. But by the 15th century, some towns and cities were genuinely trying. Streets were being paved and occasionally washed. Public latrines were better maintained. Waste removal services, while still gross, were more regulated. Some cities even designated zones where tanners and butchers could dump their filth, far away from residential areas. It wasn't Paris in spring, but it was a massive upgrade from just throw it in the alley and pray. Scholars debate whether this period marks the true beginning of modern hygiene. Some argue that the real revolution came later, during the Enlightenment or Industrial Age. Others say the seeds were planted here, as public health and cleanliness became tied to civic pride and political image. Kings and nobles began commissioning hygiene reforms not just for moral reasons, but because cleaner cities meant healthier workers, and healthier workers meant more tax revenue. As usual, follow the money. and the soap. You walk through one of these emerging cleaner towns and it feels different. There's still mud, yes, and the occasional mystery puddle, but also little stone fountains, tidy market stalls, even the occasional perfumery with glass bottles in the window. You pass a woman dabbing her temples with scented oil, a child washing his hands before lunch, and a shopkeeper sweeping dust off his doorstep instead of just stomping it into the ground. It's not modern, but it's progress. So while the Middle Ages didn't suddenly discover hot showers and deodorant, they began stumbling, awkwardly, sometimes hilariously, toward a world where not being filthy was no longer a spiritual red flag. Cleanliness was becoming less suspect, more expected. A quiet cultural shift was underway, and for the first time in centuries, smelling decent might not get you accused of sorcery. And now, in our final chapter, we'll step back and look at the big picture. How the grime of the past continues to cling to modern culture. How our current obsession with hygiene grew out of ancient fears, and why history's dirtier centuries still echo in your daily shower routine. You've made it. You've trudged through every filth-crusted alley, sat in every public bathhouse that doubled as a gossip den, listened to monks debate dirt versus divinity, and endured more conversations about historical bodily functions than you probably thought possible. But before we wrap this wonderfully grim tour of medieval hygiene, let's pause for one last rinse, something a little different. Tonight, we're taking a step back. We're looking at the legacy, the big picture, because even though the Middle Ages ended centuries ago, their hygiene habits, or lack thereof, left an impression that still lingers like the faint scent of old chamber lie in a too small room. So, what do we carry with us from that notoriously unwashed era? The truth is, a lot more than you'd think. Every time you reach for a bar of soap, wince at a public restroom, or light a candle in the bathroom for reasons, you're brushing up against the long, strange evolution of cleanliness. A journey that started in a world where being clean was suspicious, washing your hands was optional, and toilets were architectural afterthoughts. Let's start with language. We still use terms rooted in medieval grime. Gardy-loo, that old shout of warning before dumping a chamber pot out the window. It's gone now, but the fear it represented lives on every time someone slams a restroom door and yells, "Don't go in there." Our word loo for toilet may even trace back to that phrase. And toilet itself once meant a dressing table or cloth, proof that bodily business used to be something you did with a touch of grace, or at least lace. And think about modern bathroom design. Those tiled, ventilated, endlessly scrubbed spaces we take for granted. That's centuries of overcompensation for a time when going to the bathroom involved balancing over a hole in the floor while praying you wouldn't fall in or attract a rat. Our obsession with privacy, locks, fans, a full separate room dedicated to just this one task, is a cultural echo of an age where every aspect of hygiene was profoundly public, awkward, and occasionally life-threatening. Even our cleanliness standards come from reacting to the past. The Victorian era, just a few centuries after the late Middle Ages, went full cleanliness overdrive in part because of what came before. Filth had become symbolic of backwardness. The cleaner you were, the more civilized you appeared. Soap ads in the 19th century didn't just promise a nice smell, they promised social mobility. Clean skin became linked with virtue. And that idea didn't pop out of nowhere. It was built on centuries of medieval grime slowly chipping away, and that nervous energy we have around germs, that deep unease about touching subway poles or not washing your hands after sneezing, that's modern science catching up with medieval instinct. People back then didn't understand bacteria, but they knew stench meant danger. They believed in bad air or miasma, and tried to avoid it with herbs, perfumes, and occasionally just holding their breath while passing cesspits. Today, we have hand sanitizer. They had rosemary on a stick. Honestly, same vibe. Let's talk about health rituals too. Detoxing, fasting, herbal tonics, spa weekends. Strip away the branding and what do you have? Echoes of medieval practices. People believed in purging bad humours, sweating out sickness, bathing in restorative waters, or cleansing themselves, spiritually and physically during Lent. Today we drink green sludge and sit in infrared saunas. Is it better? Sure. Is it all that different? Debatable. And there's something almost poetic about how the very practices we once mocked, communal bathing, herbal treatments, minimalism, are circling back into fashion. Public bathhouses are making a comeback in wellness culture. Cold plunges are trendy again. Natural soaps and shampoos that avoid synthetic chemicals? That's essentially high-end peasant hygiene with a better Instagram filter. You can pay $60 for shampoo made with lye and essential oils, and it's basically what a monk used to whip up in a wooden bowl 800 years ago. Of course, there are still cultural ghosts from the era of dirt suspicion. Some countries have vastly different views on hygiene based on their histories. In parts of Europe, bidets are the norm. In others, they're treated like tiny bathroom fountains nobody dares use. Americans famously obsess over daily showers. The Japanese take cleaning so seriously, even public schools get scrubbed by the students. These habits are shaped by centuries of tradition, some practical, some spiritual, and some just pure inertia passed down through generations who are trying really hard not to die of a skin infection. And here's a weird fringe ripple effect. Medieval hygiene panic may have even helped shape architecture. In cities built atop old medieval streets, the winding alleys and cramped layouts still hint at a time when people dumped their waste wherever they could and hoped it'd all wash downhill. Some scholars even argue that early zoning laws, separating tanners, butchers and fishmongers from residential areas, evolved from desperate attempts to make towns slightly less unbearable. So where are we now in this grand, messy story of human hygiene? Well, we've gone from communal dirt piles to scented toilet paper, from treating acne with urine to treating it with lasers, from bathing once a year to feeling weird if we skip a day. We've invented antibacterial everything, made hand washing into an art form, and turned bathrooms into sanctuaries. But if you scratch the surface, you'll find 1,000 years of sweat, superstition, and soap experiments underneath. You leave this journey a little more grateful for your shower, perhaps a little more respectful of your plumbing, and definitely a lot more suspicious of medieval cleansing rituals. You realise that what we call modern hygiene is really just a long, winding path out of darkness, sometimes literally, and toward the light of a functioning water heater. So as you reach for your toothpaste, or lather your hands, or flush the toilet without needing to shout a warning out the window first, remember, you're living in the distant dream of a medieval peasant. You're the impossibly clean, slightly smug, sweet-smelling future they never imagined. And honestly, that's kind of beautiful. And that's the end of our journey through the gloriously grimy world of medieval hygiene. If you're still awake, congrats. You've endured chamber pots, rotting socks, saintly stink, and fullers squishing wool in pee. You've walked through towns where everyone shared bath water, sat in outhouses with spiders the size of fists, and watched doctors diagnose illness by taste-testing body fluids. It's been a lot. But in the quiet of your clean, climate-controlled room, it's also kind of comforting, isn't it? Because when you strip it all down, not in a bathhouse way, the story of medieval hygiene is really just the story of humans doing their absolute best with what they had, most of the time. Sure, it involved some questionable decisions and a lot of glorified dirt, but it also showed resourcefulness, tradition, and the occasional accidental stroke of genius. And slowly, over centuries, it led us to the world of toothbrushes, showers, and scented candles. So tonight, as you curl into your fresh sheets, washed, perhaps not in chamber lye, remember, you're the living proof that we've come a long way. You can breathe deep, you can scrub as often as you want, and you can know that you'll never have to explain to your neighbour why your cloak smells like the guard robe. Sleep well, friends. You've earned it.